he makes this amazing statement about the stakes of the United States' success or not, in his view. Yeah. And he says the United States are destined either to surmount the gorgeous history of feudalism or else prove the most tremendous failure of time.
Yeah, but no pressure. He's saying, look, there are dangers, not just ordinary dangers, but appalling dangers of universal suffrage. And in 2022, pretty much wherever you are on the political spectrum in the United States, you can empathize.
The host of Joe's Great Books is Joe Sharkey. He teaches at the University of Washington, Tacoma, but is not speaking for or sponsored by the UW. Hey everyone, long time, no podcast. Well, I got COVID, and then I got busy at work, and I do have a real job. That line about the show coming out monthly, let's call that aspirational. This episode is a longer one though, so let's backdate it to February and count it for March 2. For those of you watching this on the intergalactic archives in the distant future, we're in 2024. So, I have to work on my S's when I say so. It keeps sounding like so. So, Claudine Gay resigned from the presidency of Harvard the day before I had planned to publish my previous podcast back in early January. I think that was appropriate, but more for the hypocrisy regarding free speech on campus than the plagiarism. But despite my joke in the podcast about fire versus fired, I didn't celebrate her demise. It still works there, well paid anyway. I felt sympathy for her, but maybe that's because I don't know her or don't know what it's like to work under her as president. In any case, I cringed at Congresswoman Stefanik's gloating. So I postponed the podcast for a few days so it wouldn't look like I was piling on. And then Gay came out with her opinion piece in the New York Times, which reminded me of a few of the things I despise about identity politics. She wrote, "On Tuesday, I made the wrenching but necessary decision to resign as Harvard's president. For weeks, both I and the institution to which I've devoted my professional life have been under attack. My character and intelligence have been impugned. My commitment to fighting anti-Semitism has been questioned. My inbox has been flooded with invective, including death threats. I've been called the N-word more times than I care to count. My hope is that by stepping down, I will deny demagogues the opportunity to further weaponize my presidency in their campaign to undermine the ideals animating Harvard since its founding. Excellence, openness, independence, truth. It is not lost on me that I make an ideal canvas for projecting every anxiety about the generational and demographic changes unfolding on American campuses. A black woman selected to lead a storied institution. Someone who views diversity as a source of institutional strength and dynamism. Someone who has advocated a modern curriculum that spans from the frontier of quantum science to the long-neglected history of Asian Americans. Someone who believes that a daughter of Haitian immigrants has something to offer the nation's oldest university." End quote. Now, that's just part of it, and I won't parse it, but it's embarrassing for its relentless passive aggression, which is when you make your weakness into a weapon. Its unwillingness to accept more than what we might call a micro-responsibility for the whole mess. Its repeated self-valorizing, when what was due was a good old-fashioned apology. And its claims of victimhood and martyrdom. Even the liberals who are still holding on to their old-school principles, just barely, which is more than I can say for most in the Trump era. Even those few, like for example Ruth Marcus and Tom Nichols, just can't help themselves. They acknowledge the plagiarism and call for Gay's resignation, which was clearly hard for them to do, so good on them. But they can't stop themselves from playing the racism card. Yeah, you got our Claudine, they say, but you're racists. On December 23rd in the Washington Post, Marcus calls for Gay's resignation, but pauses in the second paragraph to make sure everyone knows she's one of the good guys. This was not my original instinct. I thought, and continue to believe, that Gay's accusers and their allies were motivated more by conservative ideology and the desire to score points against the most elite of institutions than by any commitment to academic rigor. Well, that may be true of certain of Gay's accusers, but we shouldn't assume it is until she proves it. And Marcus doesn't even try. Same goes for her next claim. This was and is accompanied by no small dose of racism in the conviction that a black woman couldn't possibly be qualified to lead Harvard. No, Ruth. The fact that she plagiarized that blatantly, that often, proves she wasn't qualified to be president of Harvard. And her failure to defend the free speech that Harvard has long claimed to defend is worse. Marcus seems to be saying, yeah, but Rufo and Christopher Brunette didn't know that before they proved it. Which reminds me of the Seinfeld episode in which Elaine is charged with collecting coats at a party and manages to drop one out the window of the apartment building. When the jacket is missed, the guy hosting the party asks Elaine to pay for it, and of course she's insulted. Jerry says, yeah, but you did drop the jacket out the window. And she responds, yeah, but he doesn't know that. Tom Nichols writes in The Atlantic, some of Gay's defenders, especially in academia, have nevertheless taken the bait from right-wingers who always wanted to make Gay's very existence as Harvard's president into a larger debate about diversity and race on campus. Gay herself, in her resignation letter, speaks of racist attacks against her. Gay herself said so, and Gay's presidency was always already about diversity and race, because that is why she got the job, at least in part. No serious person denies it. Her record just doesn't merit it otherwise. It's the strange argument, as I've heard many make, that affirmative action is vital. But you're a racist if you suggest anyone ever got a position because of it. Heather McDonald is good at pointing that out. Nichols goes on strong to write, but none of that is relevant to the charges themselves. Look, there's a term for the particular kind of plagiarism discovered by racists and other bad people. Plagiarism. So, yes, Marcus and Nichols land on the correct side regarding the plagiarism, but only while indulging in what I think is arguably a worse offense. They ring the racism bell at their political opponents when they don't have any evidence of it. They're just appealing to the instinct to imagine that your political opponents are not just wrong on the issue, but bad people. In fact, the very worst kind of person you can think of, a racist. This tactic now no longer strikes us as outrageous, only because it has become so common. As John Stuart Mill describes improprieties in arguments, he decries this move as, quote, the worst offense. He writes, the worst offense of this kind, which can be committed by a polemic, is to stigmatize those who hold the contrary opinion as bad and immoral men. Now, I should add parenthetically that Mill is talking about using this strategy against those holding the minority view. But that certainly applies to Rufo in the context of the readership of the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and about 105% of college campuses nowadays. Of course, ascribing malice to the opposition is something both poles of the political spectrum do as a default, and they shouldn't. We see once again that everything we really needed to know we learned in kindergarten, because that's when we all read Mill's On Liberty. Because that's how good our educational system is in these United States. But rather than end this preface on the claim that this kind of childish, shameless accusation is the bread and butter of your typical DEI zealot or campus bureaucrat, which it is, I'll end with a shocking and pleasant surprise. Recently, I met a DEI official who is an exception to the rule. Me. And no, I'm not kidding. She seems to understand the word diversity to mean diversity. And best of all, to include diversity of viewpoint. That follows from the apparent fact that she understands the word inclusion to mean inclusion. Seems like a woman I can work with. We'll have to see how things develop, of course, but I can say now that when I said last podcast that we should fire them all, well, I'd like to amend that. All minus one. Now, I'm certainly not going to name her, in case there's a DEI zealot watching, because that would be bad press for my new friend. That's unfortunate, of course, but c'est la vie. Just a few notes about this podcast on Walt Whitman. It was originally recorded back in the summer of 2022 with my good friend David Morris. It's a long one, about 2.5 hours, so for the first time, I've added chapters to the YouTube details. So you should be able to fast forward to what looks interesting to you. Hope I did it right. For example, I enjoyed reminiscing with David about his life and wide-ranging experience as a teacher, especially his experience as a founding faculty member of the University of Washington, Tacoma. But if you want to jump right to Whitman's biography or discussion of Democratic Vistas, the chapters make that easy. There's also a point where I outline the main argument of Whitman's very long essay. I thought I might move it to the beginning, but I ended up liking it where it was, toward the end, as a kind of summary. But if you like your outlines up front, just jump to an outline of Democratic Vistas about 2.5 hours in. In the details, I've also included links to a healthy list of articles about free speech and DEI in light of the October 7 attacks, in the Israeli military actions since. Last, please subscribe, like, comment, and share. Seriously, put that algorithm to work for me. I need it. I hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Joe's Great Books, a podcast about the great books of the Western literary tradition for the common man, the ordinary guy, and the average Joe, hosted by one of them, me. Today I have my very special guest, David Morris, and we are going to talk about Walt Whitman's Democratic Vistas. Thanks for coming on the show, David. I appreciate it very much. Longtime friend of mine and academic at the University of Washington, Tacoma. So I think that probably the best thing to do is to start off with a little bit of your biography. So I'll start off. David, I don't know your middle name. What is it?
Copeland.
Copeland, I didn't know that. That's a cool middle name. David Copeland Morris, I've only known him for a quarter century, was born in 1947. And at this point, I said I would ask you if you could just tell us a little bit about anything you want to about your childhood, but mainly about your education, because at Joe's Great Books, it's all about credentials.
Well, first of all, glad to be here. Thank you, Joe. And it's interesting that you asked that because having attained the ripe old age of 75, I have been looking back at my childhood to reevaluate it and see where I came from. And one thing I've concluded is that I grew up in a rather special time in the Midwest in the 1950s. In the suburbs of Chicago, and all those things which seemed very normal at the time, when I look back up and now they seem very special and unusual, really, because the 1950s were a time of great optimism other than the possibility of impending nuclear annihilation. We did duck under our desks during drills at school because this would save us from the atomic bomb. But other than that, one of the rituals was the new cars that were produced every year, and as a young boy, I was very excited about going and looking at them in the showrooms with my friends. We discussed them, no thought of pollution or gas mileage or anything like that. And there seemed like there were technological advances, coming every year. And so there was an idea that science and technology would make life better and better. And there really were no drawbacks to it that were in people's consciousness, I don't think.
There were those factory jobs too, right?
There were factory jobs, and people could support a family by and large with one wage earner. So most of the mothers that I knew of friends of mine did not work. A few of them did, but it was, I guess, we call it upper middle class suburb, middle to upper middle class. And then I went to college at the University of Michigan, another Midwestern institution. And
the football team going to be this year?
The football team, I always tell people that we went to the Rose Bowl the year before I got there, and I went to the Rose Bowl the year after I left. And the 4 years I was there was terrible. Lost to Michigan State 4 years in a row.
Ooh.
So that's my memory. But it's interesting because for my background, just that I was there from 1965 to 1969. And these were crucial years in American cultural history. When I got there in 65, the fraternity system was very strong. By the time I left in 69, the fraternity system had pretty much collapsed. When I was a freshman, there was very little marijuana. There was occasionally at a party, with fringe people. Sophomore year, there was more of it. Junior year, you go to a party and there would be marijuana smoke in the room. Wow. And by senior year, it would be expected that everyone would be stoned. I wasn't a stoner, but that was the general climate. And from the standpoint of sexual mores, when I was a freshman, I was in a dorm that was called co-ed, but really was two separate wings, and only the dinner and lunch areas were co-educational. But you could only have a girl on the board on the men's side from Friday and Saturday evenings, and it could only happen if a majority of people on the floor voted for it.
Really? Wow.
And the girls had to be out by 12:30 on Friday, and they had to be out by 1 o'clock on Saturday. And the RAs, the people in charge of the dorm, they checked on that. And also you had to have your door open at 45-degree angle minimum, and you had to have at least 2 feet on the floor. One from each person had to be on the floor of the they checked on that too.
You had the Dick Van Dyke rules.
It was very much a different time. And the interesting thing is, by the time I was a senior, women were living openly in the dorms, coeducationally, in the fullest possible.
And people knew they were women.
And people knew they were women. And so that was a very interesting time to be there. And it coincided with the Vietnam War also, which the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was 65.
Yeah.
And by 69, the Vietnam War was in full rage.
That's nuts. What might be nuts to you, to turn around, is ask you about Michigan, because my wife is a Michigan fan.
Mm-hmm.
I am a fan of a different team. I went to a different school, and my school had almost the same rules that you did, but a lot later. Right? So in the late 80s, Notre Dame had varietals, and as far as I know, still does.
After the 50s, with President Eisenhower, the grandfatherly figure, followed by the young, dashing Jack Kennedy. Yes. But in 65, Kennedy had been dead for a year and a half. Yeah. And Lyndon Johnson was president, who did a lot of good things, but was not a charismatic figure. So it was very bit of a shock to go from the 50s to the 60s during those 4 years. Mm. And then I went to 1969, after I graduated with a degree in English. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for a master's in English. Okay. And that was a shock because it was a much smaller school in a much smaller town. And not a lot seemed to be happening in the town. And I lived outside in the country. And a friend of mine once called me, who was at Harvard Law School, and he was watching a riot take place on the campus of Harvard protesting the war. Yeah. And he told me the revolution was happening. And I was sitting in my apartment out in the country listening to the crickets. And I said, I'm not so sure that's the case. Yeah. But I got a master's in English, but I was inspired by the poetry of Robinson Jeffers that I encourage everybody to read if they're not familiar with him. Mm-hmm. And he was an environmentalist way, way before his time. Yes. And I wanted to do something practical in an environmental vein. So I then went to the planning school at Chapel Hill and got a master's in regional planning. Then got a job out in Washington State, where I'd always wanted to go out west. And I worked in a county planning office in Bellingham, Washington for 3 years. What I was watching, as far as public debates about land use in my job, were reflecting some underlying cultural beliefs that I wanted to investigate more fully. And so I wanted to do an American Studies program. I went back to the University of Washington, where I could essentially sort of put one together. It was in the English department. And so I did that and ended up writing a dissertation on Robinson Jeffers, but also on the relationship of environmental issues to literary works. Because of my background, having both a master's in planning and a PhD in English, I was in the interdisciplinary writing program at UW Seattle. And we taught linked writing courses to a variety of subject courses in the rest of the school. I ended up teaching writing courses linked to biology, international studies, economics, European history.
Now you taught it at UCLA and Butler.
Well, then I taught at UW, and then I got a job in UCLA writing programs as a non-tenured lecturer. And that was, they had linked courses, so I also taught linked courses there. And because I had this strange background, I was also charged with inventing a course on writing for medical professionals. And I taught that a couple of times. It was mainly pre-med students or pre-nursing students. And I also, the strangest course I ever taught was a linked writing course with a master's class in the dentistry school in oral biology. I knew absolutely nothing about the topic, and all my students were already practicing dentists.
Oh, really?
It was 1 day a week, an hour at lunchtime, credit, no credit. And I soon discovered they were not going to read anything outside of class. So I essentially brought in articles for them to read, and we would critique together. And they were very nice to me because it was a break from their usual routine. Okay. And they gave me the highest course evaluations I've ever gotten for a course I knew absolutely nothing about.
I had no idea about these unusual classes you taught, so I should have interviewed you maybe 10 years ago. I'm glad I finally am getting to know you, David.
Yeah, I
like to call you Copeland.
I've had a very eclectic teaching career. Yeah. Then I finally got a conventional job from UCLA, a tenure line job as assistant professor at Butler University in Indianapolis. And I taught there for 2 years. And then by chance, the Tacoma campus of the University of Washington started up in the fall of 1990. Right. And it just so happened, as fate has it, that the dean of both branch campuses in Tacoma and Bothell was the woman who I had TA'd for in the honors program when I was a graduate student at UW. So I got an interview. And I did.
She knew quality.
I knew well enough in the interview. I got the job. And so I was part of the founding faculty of the University of Washington, Tacoma, that started with 13 faculty members.
The 13 Olympians, as the rest of us called you.
Well, yeah.
I was hired about 9 years after that. And in no small reason because of David being on the committee.
One of our very best hires ever.
By this much. Only because of a certain resolute and wise faculty member who was on the committee, as I have since been told. The program was called the Liberal Studies Program, and now it's the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences Program. Actually, it's not a program now, it's a school, which is kind of like a college, except not. Functions like a college. And it was kind of a quirky place, maybe still a quirky place, but originally you had just two majors, right? American and International? Is that what it was?
We had, no, it wasn't even called American Studies because that would have been too conventional. It was called United States Studies.
United States Studies.
And International Studies.
And it wasn't even a major, it was a concentration.
It was a concentration.
Because they don't want to call it major because that sounded, recognizable.
Too traditional. Too traditional.
And so they had concentrations, and if I recall, you headquartered in something called Self and Society.
No, that was considerably later.
Oh, but okay, so the concentrations came in after the original two. I mean, the
original two were there for a number of years before we had any sub-concentration.
Okay. And that was before there was really a campus. You're just in the...
We had 4 floors of an office building in downtown Tacoma.
Yeah.
The top 4 floors.
Yeah.
One was offices, one was classrooms, one was the library, and one was administrative.
Wow, okay.
And it was very cozy. And one of the amazing things about it is we had only 13 faculty members, but we were a branch of the University of Washington, which has about 40,000 students. Yeah. And so we had some perks that people on the Seattle campus wouldn't have, one of which was to be able to order books from the University of Washington Library and have them delivered to our mailboxes the next day.
No stacks for you, just...
No.
It was like Amazon.
It was like Amazon before it was born. Yeah.
Those early days were cool, and I would, I spent too much time here, but I would be curious to hear what you thought about those. So maybe when you come back for the next podcast, we'll talk about poetry, maybe Robinson Jeffers. See, it's on film now, so you have to come back for a second one. Maybe I'll ask you more about those days, but I remember you had some very innovative approaches to education, and one was having oral exams that you would do with other professors in film and then watch later. You guys really rolled up your sleeves. Right?
We were chartered by a committee on the Seattle campus of the University of Washington, and they wanted us to do every innovative thing that they couldn't do. So one of the things they wanted us to do was to have oral presentations and oral skills as part of the curriculum. So we were to videotape, and this is primitive videotape before iPhones and such, 1990. And so we did that, but we found that it was incredibly burdensome because we would spend a lot of time videotaping each student and then critiquing it. We really weren't trained in doing this. So that became less and less. And finally, it was simply sort of grading students on their oral participation in class and encouraging them to speak up and trying to get everyone to participate in discussion.
Yeah, I've been going back to that myself in classes recently, just because I'm teaching freshman class. Free effing speech in the academy. Yes, I'm very proud. But I've been trying to get students to speak up so that they feel comfortable doing that. And I did oral exams, but they were very, very gentle. But I was thinking back to those days that I was not part of, but that I heard about. So you're still mentoring me, David, after all these years. To finish, I should point out that the sad part of the story is that in 2012, to my dismay and his bliss, David retired from UW Tacoma and is living it up in a beautiful house in La La Land. And as I said something similar about our good friend Mike Allen, who was also one of the 13 Olympians, founding faculty, in a podcast either before or after this one. We'll determine that later. You are the main guy who helped me get my job, which is equivocal praise, but you're also one of my very best friends, which is not. So thank you for coming on the show. I am honored to have you.
My extreme pleasure.
So from one great world historical figure to another, we'll go from David Copeland Morris to Walt Whitman. And I'm not going to give any comprehensive biography. I am not a Whitman specialist. I'm not even an Americanist. I teach mainly European literature. I would like to include more American lit, just because I think that as the globe gets smaller, the traditions blend, they merge. And that's part of the beautiful thing about literature. There's no reason to keep them separate, especially since there are so many interconnections, which is what I found when I read Democratic Vistas on David's recommendation. We'll get to that later, but let's go back to Walt. Walt Whitman was born in 1819 in Long Island, New York, the second son of, Walter Whitman, a house builder, and Louisa Van Velser. I should point out I took all this detail from poets.org. I'll put the website in the detailed section of the podcast, as always. He was one of 9 children, and he attended the Brooklyn public schools. At the age of 12, young Walt began to learn the printer's trade, and as the poets.org puts it, he fell in love with the written word. He was largely an autodidact, as he taught himself, and he read voraciously as a teen. And poets.org highlighted 4 of my favorites: Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and the Bible. So Walt, as you probably know, was something of a rebel, but like everything else with Whitman, it's nuanced. And so he was, I think we could say for the moment, a rebel, but within the tradition. And you don't dive into Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and the Bible and let that influence you without being, in some sense, a traditionalist. But I think he's essentially just a practitioner, a participant of the great books tradition. He worked as a printer in New York City until a fire burned down the publishing district fires. Can you imagine that? A fire burned down his place of business. That must have been a pain in the ass. I don't know if that's an inside joke at this point or not, but at some point I'll explain why that's funny in a gallows humor sort of way. At 17, he began a career as a teacher in Long Island, continued until 1841 in his 20s, when he returned to journalism as a full-time career. Founded a weekly newspaper, edited another. I won't go through them. I don't even know what the difference is between this or that. Do you know?
Well, the Brooklyn Eagle he worked for a long time. But one thing I was just going to say, he, as I remember it, one of the reasons he gave up teaching is that he did not inflict corporal punishment on his students, and therefore he could not maintain discipline. And he realized it was not for him, or the people who employed him realized it was not for him.
Well, it was too soft to be a teacher. He was. Corporal punishment abounds in my classes, especially that gentle freshman class that I teach. That's a great detail.
I think it's true. I hope so.
It put it in the category of stories about the authors you teach that you so desperately want to be true that you don't investigate, because if you find out they're false, then you can't say them anymore.
Right.
But if you just don't find out, then you can just qualify and say, well, I'm not sure because this is true. I would say that about Descartes. Supposedly Descartes died in Sweden. René Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy. He died in Sweden. And as his body made its way back to France to be buried, legend has it that parts of him were picked off because people thought he was going to be beatified, canonized as a saint, a Catholic saint. And that hardly happens. Instead, he got landed on the index of forbidden books. But anyway, people thought he was going to be a saint. And so they would apparently open up the casket or a cart, and they would take a little finger off of the cart because they thought it would be a holy relic, and maybe they could open up a shrine or sell it on the Saints Digits Market. Well, if you find out it's not true, you know whom not to tell.
Right. I'll keep it to myself.
Back to Walt Whitman. Yes, you're right. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle was one he worked at, apparently for quite some time. Editor, I think also a writer. At a certain point in 1848, he witnessed auctions of enslaved individuals in New Orleans. I went back to Brooklyn in 1948 and founded a, quote, free soil newspaper. So apparently Whitman's attitudes about race, according to a quote from poets.org, his attitudes were sometimes described as unstable and inconsistent. Apparently, he didn't always take the side of abolition, which to me is surprising, based on what I remembered of him and what I read in Democratic Vistas, where it seems to me, based just on what I knew, I would have said he was clearly an abolitionist.
I believe the free soil movement was, they did not want slavery extended into any new territory.
Okay, so he wanted to maintain it.
And he believed that slavery was a great evil. He was totally opposed to slavery as an institution, but for reasons of preserving the Union, which became very important to him, and obviously in the Civil War, he was not an abolitionist.
Okay. Wow.
Because to be an abolitionist meant, he felt, I think, that it would bring on a civil war. And he wanted to avoid that. And I think that was a fair statement of his position. But he was morally opposed to slavery, appalled by it. As far as his opinion of the equality of the races, he had kind of a abstract notion of equality for all peoples, but he also had a few passages in his journals where he was, less than generous toward certain races at certain times.
Well, thank you for telling us that. We always want to be, want to get to the truth about it, even if it, as in this particular case, is disappointing. Whitman's, I guess you could say, his main work was this collection called Leaves of Grass that he published in more than one edition over the course of his career. And my notes say it was 1855.
He published, self-published his book of poems called Leaves of Grass. They did not have titles. the longest poem, which came to be known, the song myself, had no title to begin with. There was very little punctuation. The only punctuation was ellipses. And the later editions had more conventional punctuation, and they also had numbered sections where he divided up the works that way. And the fascinating story about that is that he sent a copy of it to Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yeah.
And he was, I think, 36, 37 years old at the time. And he sends it to Emerson, who's probably the premier American intellectual of the time. And you would think, the premier intellectual of the time getting an unsolicited manuscript would say, toss it in the wastebasket, or get one look at it and give it to his assistant to read or whatever.
Right.
Instead, Emerson read it, and he wrote a letter back to Whitman and said it was the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom he had yet read by an American author. So you can imagine the comparable situation today, someone completely unknown sending a manuscript to the most famous public intellectual, and then an intellectual sending him back saying it's the best thing I've read so far. And Whitman, in his way, in subsequent editions of Leaves of Grass, without Emerson's permission, he published that letter as part of the book. But there were many editions. There was 1855, 1816, which added poems. Each edition added poems.
Okay.
And the final edition was called the Deathbed Edition. I think it was 1892. And that edition is where the poems are mainly taken from when they're anthologized in literary anthologies.
Those are regarded as the kind of authorized or completed editions?
Yeah, although some critics like the earlier ones because they feel they're more spontaneous, more true to the original, somewhat mystical vision that Whitman had.
More raw.
They're more raw, and they're more iconoclastic in the sense that they have no punctuation and no titles.
That's fun. That's kind of crazy. The reason it's crazy, if you haven't read Walt Whitman, is that he's already very difficult. So after we get done with his bio, that's something we're going to go to pretty quick, which is the language of Walt Whitman, in specifically Democratic Vistas, because it's crazy and wonderful and very, very challenging. And so the idea that there would be no punctuation, you wouldn't even have these little kind of courtesy guardrails to help you make heads or tails of what he's written, strikes me as you can tell, hilarious.
Well, but we should point out the Democratic Vistas is a prose piece.
Yes.
And this, the book of Leaves of Grass was a book of poetry. Although it was also, we should point out that Leaves of Grass, the poetry, was also very innovative in the sense that it's really the first book of free verse published.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I knew it was free verse.
Whitman he's the originator and father of free verse.
Oh, fascinating.
It's verse that has no regular rhyme scheme and no regular metrical scheme. Although it has what Whitman would call inherent rhythms to it.
And it does. If you read it, it just damn well does. I mean, his prose does.
And his prose does too.
His prose, you could probably put his prose in skinnier margins.
They don't sound that much.
Free verse.
They don't sound that much different. But so he was quite an innovative person who seemed to sort of come out of nowhere in the sense that he never went to college. Had very little formal education. The rest of the people in his family were not intellectuals. And he was a journalist. A self-taught journalist.
It's so perfect. I guess it makes sense. But the things that he came to celebrate, in his poetry, are essentially all of that. And it's just, I love it because it reminds me of this nobody coming from Podunk Stratford, learning out to dominate the London dramatic scene, the theater scene, Shakespeare, and that's what Whitman is all about. And that's one of the many things he thinks America is all about.
Yes, right.
And it's rat-tat-too. It's just rat-tat-too. Am I right to say that the three poems he's best known for, obviously Song of Myself, but then I Sing the Body Electric and Sleepers, are those three of his biggest?
Probably people know him from Lilac's Last in the Dooryard Gloom, which is a eulogy for Abraham Lincoln. So that is a poem that's often anthologized.
Captain, My Captain.
And Oh Captain, My Captain, which is also
about Lincoln too.
About Lincoln too, which in my view is not one of his great poems, but it is often anthologized.
And it was in the Dead Poets Society, so
it
was in a movie, so it got to be good. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he was a freelance journalist and then also visited the wounded in New York City area hospitals. He traveled to Washington, D.C. in 1862 to care for his brother who had been wounded in the war. And there's this beautiful piece, part of Democratic Vistas, where he talks about serving as a kind of nurse in these hospitals during the Civil War. And he was so impressed and touched and overwhelmed by the misery of the wounded that he decided to stay and work in the hospitals. And he ended up staying for 11 years, it says here. That seems to have been important to him in understanding America, or more specifically, just Americans.
Yeah, and he actually had a kind of physical and mental, not breakdown, but a crisis from having done this and seen so much pain and suffering. And he went to I believe it was on Long Island, to a farm owned by a friend of his, I think, out in the country. And he recovered and wrote a book called Specimen Days, which has an account of his time in the hospitals during the Civil War, but also an account of his recovery time out in the country that had some beautiful nature writing in it. And he was a city guy for the most part, but he really found solace in being in a what today we call green environment. And that Specimen Days I recommend to people who are interested, especially anyone interested in accounts of the Civil War. It's the best thing I've ever read about what the Civil War was like at a personal level.
Wow, wonderful. That's a great tip. I'll try to remember to put that in the deets section of the podcast and with links. And one of the wonderful things about Walt Whitman is that all of his writings are public domain. So we can read as much as we damn well please. You can get it all, Project Gutenberg, or all sorts of other sites as you like. Let's finish off. 1873, Whitman suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. In the same year, he traveled to Camden, New Jersey to visit his dying mother. He bought a home, stayed there, and worked on his additions and revisions, apparently, to the Leaves of Grass of 1891 to 2. Is that right? 1992, which is the deathbed edition. What a great title for your final edition, your deathbed edition. And he worked on some other poems in prose. So 1892 is when Walt Whitman finally went to rejoin the divine, the ineffable, the unutterable, the cosmic. Song of Myself, his most famous poem, his best poem, his best work, probably. Would you agree? Full of this kind of brilliance and cispun and enthusiasm and energy, and it's just so much fun. But we're going to read Democratic Vistas. So, David, why are we going to read Democratic Vistas?
Democratic Vistas is a essay that I first encountered in a graduate seminar in University of Washington. And I had seen the title, but I had never read the essay. And I'd been intrigued by the title. But in this class, I was really struck by the essay. I thought it was a profound piece of writing and thinking. And I also find it to be today more relevant than ever because the idea of America is never been more contested, I think. Well, I shouldn't say never more, but certainly is strongly contested today. In 2006, the Atlantic Monthly published an issue called The American Idea and said that the magazine was founded by Ralph Waldo Emerson, James Russell Lowell, and two others to explore the American idea, use that phrase exactly. And it seemed to me that the essay Democratic Vistas was the most rich and thought-provoking and really profound exploration and defense, but not purely a defense, of the American idea and the idea of democracy. And Whitman sees them as, he says in the essay itself that he uses democracy and America interchangeably. It seems to be at a time when the idea of democracy is challenged from both the left and the right today. Very well-known author Ibram Kendi, whose book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, suggests that there ought to be a committee appointed by the president to evaluate all doings of the government in terms of racial equality or equity, as he would say. And this committee would be appointed by the president, but then would be pretty much free to do whatever it wanted, which is essentially a fairly undemocratic idea. Yes. And on the right, you have the followers of former President Trump, who seem to, some of them anyway, feel that it would be better if the country were ruled by a strong leader who could issue decrees and could pretty much run the country like CEO of a corporation. So the idea of democracy is attacked from both sides. And Whitman is defending it, I would say, not from the center in any kind of wishy-washy or compromised way, but in a very full-hearted, strongly felt notion that democracy is essential to the development of each individual person in the country, that it's a cultural and religious idea as much as it is a political idea. And so he defends it on those grounds. And he is open to the notion that there are arguments against democracy. It's a new experience, a new structure in human history. Certainly as of 1871, if you look around the world at that time, you look at China, it's a non-democratic empire. If you look at Russia, it's ruled by a czar, and many of its citizens are serfs. If you look at France, it's gone through a revolution, but then a counter-revolution, and so it's only a partially democratic society. Britain itself, which was probably the most democratic society, is it's top an empire and has a limited franchise. So the United States really is a country that is, in some sense, the most democratic. It just fought a civil war, gave the right to vote to its Black population just recently. Not yet to women, of course, till 1920. But it is a new and radical experiment still. And that's the way Whitman sees it. And he sees it as partially successful, mostly not. But he also sees it as the most hopeful sort of country, nation, and place in the world.
In the way you described it, is there this place, this idea, this nation of potentiality? It seems that that's the way Whitman would want it to be. He would never want it not to be that. And it's this kind of perpetual nascence.
Yes.
Or renaissance, renaissance.
Yes, I'm going to read the first paragraph later, but one of the things the paragraph suggests is that society should be open to conflicting impulses.
Yes.
And allow them to flourish in the same way that the weather changes from day to day and keeps the air fresh and circulating, so it doesn't become stagnant. He saw history as an evolution, and it was constantly evolving. As an individual life was an evolution that was constantly evolving.
I was groping after a way of describing Whitman, and I can't remember what exactly it was related to, but I guess it's just as broadly as relationship between literature of the past and the new literature, the new world literature, the new American literature that he is essentially prophesying, and he uses that term in Democratic Vistas. And I was trying to figure out exactly how to describe him, and I thought he's like a pendulum, and he swings back and forth, and he's a radical here, but then he seems to come back and say, well, wait a minute, no, I can't, cut bait on the past. We owe a great debt to the tradition, but it swings back to the radical, rebellious way. And the word evolutionary is the word I came up with, because he's not leaving the past behind, but he does certainly have a direction, and the direction is always onward and upward. So one detail that we'll probably come back to is that the way I recall it when I first asked you, so would you please do a podcast with me, and what would you like to do? And you said Democratic Vistas. The main thing I remember you saying was that, well, it has such striking parallels with 2022 America. And it does. And the things that jumped out to me were the critiques. He talks about the state of American democracy and also literature, but democracy in general, against the population in general. Sometimes he throws haymakers. And if you read any of those passages, in fact, I thought about doing that with this podcast, just reading a passage that was excoriating and saying, so what do you think that, where do you think that came from? When was it written in, what era of the United States do you think it was talking about? I figure everybody would say that was written yesterday about us right now. But of course, it was written about the U.S. in 1871. So we'll see that. But as David points out, the emphasis is much more on the positive and the optimism and the enthusiasm and the hope than it is on the negativity. But the negativity is pretty striking and severe at points.
It's there. When you ask why Democratic Vistas, I think because it has also some, it investigates ideas that I think are important to today. And it tries to get at what America is, not in any kind of narrow jingoistic or patriotic sense, but what it can seriously mean, what it offers, but what also its dangers are. I'll just briefly suggest a few of the themes that I think run through it, or at least the sort of issues it explores that I think are important. And one of them I mentioned was this American idea of seeing the country as not primarily a political structure, but as a cultural and religious structure also. The democracy implies a regard for the individual, regardless of station or status. It also implies the notion of individual development, that if a system of government allows the individual to do what he or she wants to do according to their inner impulse, that will be not only enriching for that person, but that the society as a whole will benefit from allowing the fullest flourishing of each of its individual citizens. And one of the things that's interesting about it that Joe was just alluding to is that Whitman is both a radical and conservative, I would say. And one of the oppositions I see running through the piece and through his career as a whole is what I would call a conflict between excellence and egalitarianism. And he is very much an egalitarian in the most senses of that word, but he's also very concerned with producing excellence. So that his critique that Joe was mentioning of the culture of his time, he saw it largely as frivolous, as secondary to European culture, as borrowing in an unoriginal way from older cultures, as pandering to the lowest impulses of readers or theater goers or viewers of paintings. And he was very concerned that literature be excellent. At the same time, he was concerned that all people have a chance to perfect their talents. And I don't think he ever solved this problem, because I don't think it's a problem that can be fully solved until we make people in test tubes all exactly the same, like in Brave New World. But he believed that excellence, and some part of him deeply believed that excellence only counted if it emerged from voluntary contributions, that it couldn't be coerced, and it couldn't be come out of a coterie of favored elitist producers. And there's a very interesting essay by W.H. Auden about American culture and this issue, where Auden talks about America is devoted to the proposition, and he sees it as alone among the countries of the world when he was writing, which I think was in the 1930s or 40s, I believe, maybe the 50s. And he said that America is devoted to the notion that liberty is prior to what he calls virtue, meaning virtue is accomplishments, achievements, high character, and so forth. And he said that the society is based on the notion that unless these are freely available to everybody, this opportunity to develop achievements or accomplishments, that they were somehow not meaningless or were tainted. He thought the old world, European culture, was, no, at first, excellence what counted, a sort of aristocratic notion. Whether if you needed to oppress people in order to sustain an elitist class that produced excellence, then that was completely justified.
Right. It's almost necessary, right? You had to.
Almost necessary.
The average person doesn't have much talent or capacity, and so what you do is accept that, and you have the lower class, and you have the upper class that takes care of the lower class. But that sort of like Eagles, and does writes the kinds of poem that Walt Whitman writes.
And at a practical standpoint, it's you needed people to have the leisure to do the creating. They needed people to take care of their basic needs.
Somebody's got to do the work.
Someone's got to do that. So, and Brook Farm, a famous utopian experiment early in the 19th century, failed because the intellectuals that went there didn't want to do the dirty work of, cleaning up and serving their fellow members of the group. And Whitman felt that you needed a society where there was no one caste that was in charge of producing excellence while another caste supported them. And Auden sees the European idea, and most aristocratic ideas going back to most of human history, that of course an elite produces the excellent works of the culture, and of course you have a large substratum that supports them and takes out their garbage and so forth.
Yeah, a crazy new idea that we would have this, as Whitman calls it repeatedly in the Vistas, this leveling.
Yeah, that's right.
And we'll get to this later, but he constantly talks about how America produces this leveling, this flattening of, caste, of social rank, of aristocracy. So there is only one caste, not one caste in charge, just one caste, period, which is not always saying no caste. But again, it's always the nuance. It's always kind of the this way and then the other way. It's the leveling, not so that everybody is sure of remaining equal. It's so that people can bloom, so that people can be free. And so he talks about this radical, perfect personalism or individualism. And once you have this leveling, then people can become what they want, but there's no guarantee that they'll be the same or that everyone will achieve the same degree.
Yeah, and he sees it as very much an experiment because it's very much based on an idea that really had not been present in the world. There had always been a kind of caste or class system, at least in organized societies, that had an elite at the top producing the cultural artifacts of the society. And it's a kind of religious notion, which he traces back to the Bible, but he also traces it to non-Western traditions. He mentions both the Vedas and other non-Western books, but he said the idea is that there's a soul in each person that is worth protecting against the group's predations and at some level.
Yes.
And the idea that a whole society should be based on that was a new one. That it could produce excellence while also having this base level of egalitarianism.
I've been wanting to say this for a while, so let me ask you this question. When you said that it was biblical, a lot of the things that you have been saying have made me think that Whitman must, at some point, have compared the United States, America, to Eden. Because at one point you said something like, okay, this is it's there's no place like this. There's never been a place like this on Earth. Probably true, but in the psychology of the West, there is this idea of Eden. And tell me, how far this seems to you to fit. But God creates Adam and Eve, and they are free. This is informed mostly by Milton and Paradise. He creates them free. Why? Because he could have created them like automatons. He could have created them like animals that, according to Milton, only function by instinct, or rocks, which only function according to the laws of rocks, like gravity, physics. You drop a rock, and it doesn't decide, should I fall or should I rise or should I just hover? The rock falls. So can a rock be good? Now, can a dog or an animal, can a wolf be good? The answer is no. So God has this choice to make. Does he make them free with the hope, or leaving them the possibility of being good, but also with the possibility of them being evil, or choosing wrong instead of right? And he makes them free. It seems to me that fits with what enchants Whitman about the United States. It seems, and I know this, of course, is not quite true, but it seems to be this new empty country, this new possibility where people can go as if it's as if it were an uninhabited island or something, and build their own society. Now, obviously, that's not true. It was not empty, but this is part of, like, I think, the enchantment of him. That it seems like a palimpsest that he can just begin, or we can, we, the U.S. Government, the U.S. population can begin to build and make it a new place, not like that old feudal world where only certain people, well, I was going to say can rise, but actually, no, they're already risen. They're born risen, and others cannot rise because they are born unrisen.
Yeah. No, he definitely sees the evolution of history, of human history, as moving toward a egalitarian, the quotation that is often cited from Martin Luther King of the arc of history is long with bends toward justice. That comes from a theologian named Theodore Parker, who was a little earlier contemporary of Whitman's. But Whitman would have believed that, although he felt it was not assured, or he sometimes feels it's assured because he wants to convince himself that that's what's going to happen. But he also has this constant nagging worry that it won't happen, that the evolution will become a devolution and go back to, a caste system, an oppressive, hierarchical society.
So, well, that's part of the, that's part of the idea that I think it's innate to, or inherent in Eden, and inherent in what Auden was saying, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what made me think of Eden. So, look, liberty has to come first.
Yeah.
You can't force virtue. You have to start with liberty,
right.
And that makes virtue possible,
but
doesn't guarantee it.
And it's interesting that the threats from both the left and the right to democracy do see, they kind of embrace the idea that Auden mentions, that virtue or good is prior to liberty. In other words, someone like Kendi would see that racial equity is more important than democracy. If it takes undemocratic means in order to achieve racial equity, then that should be achieved. On the right, it's if you need law and order, whatever the right-wing principle is cited, if you need someone to rule by decree in order to get that, then that should be done.
And this, of course, is a very different idea of republicanism or the right than I grew up with.
Yeah, no, but this is, it's anytime that, well, when I taught a course at Tacoma, The Making of America.
Yes.
And one of the things I did when I taught it by myself after team teaching kind of ended, I handed out to the class the American Constitution and the Chinese Communist Constitution and the Constitution of Saudi Arabia. And I didn't even know whether these things existed or not. I went online, I found, lo and behold, Saudi Arabia has a constitution. Lo and behold, there's a full constitution written by the Communist Party. I think it started in 1949 and has been amended. And they're very interesting documents to compare with the American Constitution. They're not completely different, but they both are imply that, what counts is a government that promotes human flourishing. But the Saudi Arabian Constitution very explicitly states that human flourishing is achieved by a system of government that promotes Islamic virtues and Islamic teachings and Islamic practices. And the Chinese Communist Constitution says the best government is a government that promotes the welfare of the working classes and promotes egalitarianism throughout the society. And they do not have comparable documents to the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution, which was added, after the original Constitution was formed. It was added by the first Congress as part of the agreement to get people to approve the original. That there would be basically, I think, the main impetus came from Thomas Jefferson, the Bill of Rights to protect the individual against governmental power. And those are largely absent from the Saudi Arabian or the Chinese Communist.
No First Amendment.
No First Amendment. No, I mean, it would be, and it's a good illustration because the Constitution of Saudi Arabia would either explicitly or implicitly, it implies that free speech that is un-Islamic or is anti-Islamic is not allowed and is prohibited in the society. And in the Chinese Communists, it would be one that if speech defended the privileges of an aristocratic class, that speech would not be allowed. Whereas the American Constitution says the government shall pass no law that abridges the freedom of speech.
So even in the ideal versions of Saudi Arabia and China, presume that's what we see in their constitutions.
Mm-hmm.
It's still the reverse of all. It's
Yes.
a particular idea of virtue is prescribed.
Yes.
And then within that, that's circumscribed area,
Right.
you can be free.
Yeah, and that's really different than the American idea, which is in the Bill of Rights and also in the Declaration of Independence, where it just says you're entitled to, each citizen is determined deserving of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. The pursuit of happiness is left completely open.
Right. That's not.
There's no hint about how that should be achieved. That's left entirely up to the individual,
right?
To seek for him or herself.
Yeah, it's a remarkable document. We could have a podcast sometimes just on that.
And it can be critiqued. I mean, societies that think there's a particular virtue that people ought to achieve, they would see democracy as chaotic, anarchic, as allowing unvirtuous practices and thought patterns and activities to flourish, and that's a bad thing.
And they would be right. And they would be right, because it does happen, right? We see it all around.
Yes.
And that's when I first read parts of Democratic Vistas, I read the critiques, and those are what jumped out at me. And I remember the first time through thinking that it was much more negative than it actually is. And I remember, when I was growing up, the Soviet Union, of course, was the inner pole of existence. And I remember when the Soviet Union fell in 91-ish, that I remember, I was a young man, but I remember thinking, okay, so everything's good. I'm, patriot. I like, I'm a fan of democracy. And so, but I checked myself and I thought, wait a minute, just because the Soviet Union failed, does that somehow guarantee that we won't fail? And of course, the next step is you think, well, shit, what if the lack of this enemy, this foe, this rival, gives us or leaves us unfettered, so that we don't have to define ourselves against that other way of governing and living. And I do think that in some ways that is what has happened. Yeah. But again, you have to allow for it. So that's one of the big morals I had in that free speech class. They said, look, you can have the best laws in the world, but if they're not respected and they're not used well, for example, you don't choose to use your free speech wisely, well, then of course it can all go to hell. Yeah. If we're all free to behave like, bad people, we'll have a bad nation, and then pretty soon we won't have a nation. And so you were describing before kind of the two poles of our politics nowadays.
Well, the Russian
bad ideas.
The Russian example is really interesting because when the communist system ended in Russia, there was a kind of anarchy. There was a kind of feeling that no one knew quite what system would follow. And Russian people had never lived under a democratic system. They had gone straight from the autocracy of the czars to the dictatorship of the Communist Party. They had always been told what to do in a certain way, certain sense. And I think it illustrates Whitman's idea that democracy is not just a political structure, but it's a cultural system. And finally, a religious system in the sense that it's believed in at a level deeper than just habit. It's believed in a kind of core way that you do need to allow people to choose things, even if they end up being bad things for a while, with a faith that allowing them to choose things freely will eventually lead to a better outcome than having a strong leader, a strong man come in and tell you what to do. But it's a very tenuous thing. In the old Greek states where democracy really originated, they debated this idea too. The demos was very much looked at skeptically by a figure like Plato, who felt that democracy was just a recipe for chaos, and felt that an elite should govern, and so that tension has always been there.
I'm thinking of I'm thinking of Dostoevsky
Yeah.
and the Grand Inquisitor.
Yeah.
Story that shows up in the Brothers Karamazov.
Mhm.
I threatened before to do a podcast on that, but I haven't read it in a long time. It's a complex book, so
Mhm.
we'll put that on the agenda. But I believe in the Grand Inquisitor, what happens is, and it's a fascinating story, Christ comes back and he's taken captive by the Grand Inquisitor, who does what Grand Inquisitors do, which is to interrogate him. And they have this fascinating argument. And he tells Jesus that, look, what you don't understand, people don't want to be free. They want to be ruled. They want to be told what to do. Now, that it fits with what you're saying about Russia. And that's, I mean, Dostoevsky, of course, was Russian. And the tendencies that make you concerned about the country nowadays, make me concerned about the country nowadays, I guess on both ends of the spectrum, the way you described it.
Yeah.
It's more complex than that, but I think you did a good job of kind of pointing to two nodes on opposite ends. It seems like both of them want their idea of virtue imposed from the top down by some authority more than they want freedom, because freedom could risk their side losing.
Yeah. Well, and you can see it, I think, if you look at your own life, that there are times when freedom, you want to be free to choose what you want to do. But there are other times when you'd really like someone just to tell us what, tell us what to do now.
Yeah.
I had that experience with, as a founding faculty member of UW-Tacoma. We were kind of on our own. We had these guidelines from this committee on the Seattle campus that we could follow, but we also could ignore those because no one seemed to be in charge of enforcing adherence to them. And it was a very interesting thing because it was both a pleasure and a burden. It was a pleasure being able to pretty much do whatever we wanted. When I would go to academic conferences and talk to people who were in conventional English departments, they'd say, well, what do you teach and what are your courses? I'd say, well, pretty much whatever I want. I'd say, what are you talking about? Well, actually, and it was great in the sense that I could choose, the things that I wanted to teach, but it was also a burden because I thought, well, what should they, know, and what responsibilities do I have to the tradition of teaching English, right? But what do I want to break away from? Yeah. And the campus itself, we were growing and hiring people every year, which was a constant change. So things were, Whitman would say, like the weather changing, so there was constant renewal. Yeah. But there was also the threat of chaos, and sometimes overwhelming. Like you just wanted, let's have a dean who can tell us what we should do for this year.
It's a lot less like that now, but it's still a little bit like that to the point that I tell people who come, in job interviews, I say, look, it's a little bit flexy here.
Yeah. And as you say that, I think about Whitman as a individual. He was someone who clearly valued his freedom in all aspects. He pretty much charted his own path, valued his own way of writing poetry. He was enough of an independent thinker that he invented a whole new genre of writing poetry. He had the audacity to send his work to the leading intellectual of the time and expect, at some level, he must have expected a positive response, which he got. So he is a model in his life. He's thinking, I did it my way.
Yes.
It's worked out great for me.
Yes.
That's what everybody should do.
Yeah.
And he was a more conventional thinker earlier in his life because one example is he wrote a temperance novel. He'd been raised a Quaker, and he wrote this rather conventional temperance novel early in his career. And he used to refer to himself as Walter Whitman, and he dropped that later on. But he was kind of a self-invented person. Yeah. And I think we should bring up also that, lately Whitman's sexuality has been very much a part of the things that people consider when looking at him. And he's pretty obviously gay. And it's interesting that when I was in graduate school, most of the criticism about him either denied that or played that down very much. And I think that he made his way as a somewhat closeted gay man. But I think being gay also made him aware of his difference, and that as an individual, he was not conventional from the start. Yes. And so I think that had part of, at a very basic level of his being, he saw that people should be able to be what they are.
Yes. I was going to ask you about that because I had, last I read Whitman was probably literally 30 years ago, but I had thought that it was a settled issue that Walt Whitman was gay. And then in doing a little bit of research, I saw a website somewhere that said that he was probably gay. Yeah. In your opinion, that's just a miss.
Well, it's if you go back to the criticism written like in the 1950s, when Whitman talks about manly friendship and adhesiveness, in his section of poems in the later edition of Leaves of Grass called Calamus, which are really about homoerotic love, pretty clearly. Well, they were read metaphorically as the love of comrades and so forth. But if you go back and you read those poems now, it seems like there's no question that they are poems about gay relationship. And it's interesting as just a cultural, historical process, how much different the 1950s when I was a kid, the attitude toward being gay was, in that someone that's obviously gay, and as Whitman, is somehow read as not being gay. And now I think maybe the pendulum, latest criticism I've looked at, focuses, Whitman is a gay poet and reads all his writings through the lens of his gayness, which reveals a certain, important things about his work. But it seems to be a limitation on reading him.
Probably
that he would not. That he would not.
I was going to say probably he wouldn't, because he also had his manifold, persona, and it's not to be reduced.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, this is all wonderful stuff so far. What I would like to do is just, I think we're kind of approaching the end of the first segment of the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to finish with something I actually intended to bring up earlier, but I didn't fit perfectly here. It's I had the same sensation reading Democratic Vistas that I did when I read Mark Twain. And I was shocked at how apparently by happenstance or just good luck or having good friends and good mentors, how perfectly they fit into the Joe's Great Books kind of ethos. And I just wanted to identify three, although I think actually I left an obvious fourth one out that you have been expressing throughout what you've been saying, which is just the absolute foundational, essential, pervasive importance of freedom. When you talk about the climate, how everything needs to be changing, it needs to be, and we need to allow it to be that way if America is going to continue to live up to its idea of itself and to fulfill its possibilities. And that's where Walt just seems to thrive. But here are the 3 points that I saw that made me think that Whitman was just a perfect author to read early on in what I hope is a long run Joe's Great Books podcast. One, and this is just his exuberance, and especially about reading. Here's a passage. Books are to be called for and supplied on the assumption that the process of reading is not a half sleep, but in highest sense, an exercise, a gymnast's struggle. Not the book needs so much to be the complete thing, but the reader of the book does. That were to make a nation of supple and athletic minds, well-trained, intuitive, used to depend on themselves and not on a few coteries of writers. I should point out here that if that's the first Whitman you've ever heard, yep, that's the way the dude writes, and that was one of his easiest sentences. So what we'll do, I think, after I cough these up, is we'll take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about Whitman's language, and then we'll dive into some passages and see what we can see there. What you remember about Whitman, I think, as much as what he says, and even the choicest images or lines from his poetry, is just kind of his persona. I mean, the message is often in the medium; it's also often in the messenger or the man who relays it. And so that's what we come away, which I come away with remembering about Walt Whitman, even after having left him for like 3 decades. But it's delightful. The dude is always excited. I mean, upbeat is how he feels when he's depressed, and it's in part because he loves the potential of the country. I'm thinking of Democratic Vistas. In particular, he exalts that America is about ambition, creation, change, and growth. As I told my students in that freshman class I mentioned before, if you're in college, or if you're not, if you're in high school, if you're not in school, if you're just in life, apply that to yourself. He's always talking about these possibilities, these potentialities that you can make of yourself. Why not do that? Enjoy it, plunge into it as a person, as a student. Be excited, seize the day in whatever capacity you can, create. And it's just it gets you psyched. At least it gets me psyched. Second point. He celebrates the way literature unites all of us rational and souled animals. So I'm modifying Aristotle there. And that's what I talked about in the first podcast about Aristotle and rational animals, and how that's what unites all of us Great Books readers. And you can probably connect the dots and see what I think of ideas like Ibram Kendi's, which seems to me to want to divide us according to identities, and particularly according to race. So what Whitman says in relation to this is, and this is on pages 29b to 38, not but that in one sense, as he starts sentences like that, not but that in one sense, in a very grand one, good theology, good art, or good literature has certain features shared in common. The combination fraternizes, that is, brotherizes, ties the races, is in many particulars under laws applicable indifferently to all, irrespective of climate or date or from whatever source, appeals to emotion, pride, love, spirituality, common to humankind. So we'll see in other places that he talks about how democracy helps us become brothers and sisters. And if we haven't mentioned it yet, Whitman was way ahead of his time in what he thought about women. He's calling for suffrage for women in 1871, half a century before it happened. So we'll come back to that. But this idea that we are all united, we are all in some sense one, and through our reason and through our art and through our country, we Americans, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about Whitman, and even more broadly than that, one of the most beautiful things about literature. We can all read these books together. If we know the language, we're rational animals. That's it. It doesn't matter the rest of who you are. Third, he is a celebrator of the common man. He thinks that, as David's already pointed out clearly, he thinks that every individual is in some mystical way connected to the cosmos, which he often spells with a K, which is cool with a K. The all, these are all capital letters, capital K, capital A, and the divine, you guessed it, capital D. So here's a sentence from page 7b. And you often have to just pick up in medias res that is in the middle of things with Whitman, because you trace your way back to the beginning of the sentence. It's like a whole page before that. You can't read the whole thing. So ellipsis, ... The idea of that something, capital S, a man is, last precious consolation of the drudging poor, standing apart from all else, divine in his own right, and a woman in hers, sole and untouchable by any canons of authority or any rule derived from precedent, state safety, the acts of legislatures, or even from what is called religion, modesty, or art. This inviolable independence, selfness, solitariness of the single soul is wonderful, especially when you combine it, as he does, with that connection, that union that we get from the sources that I just mentioned. So it may be true that Walt was a romanticizer or idealizer of the common man, sure, but maybe I am too, maybe David is too, and I for one would rather make that error than the opposite one. One more passage, I think, 24b to 25a, finally, the personality of mortal life is most important with reference to the immortal, unknown, spiritual, the only permanently real, which, as the ocean, waits for and receives the rivers, waits for each, or for us each and all. So this kind of mystical quality, this mystical destiny that we're all destined to achieve or experience in some elusive way, that also is a way that Whitman finds union. So what we'll do is take a brief break now, make sure we're recording, and we'll come back and we'll talk about Whitman's language, and then after that we'll actually get deep into Democratic Vistas. Right. So before we dive into the content of the work, it might be helpful for the uninitiated to say a few things about Walt's language. And as I said to you in a text, boy, I'd forgotten, but it's dense. And you responded, dense but in a good way, packed with serious thought about ultimate questions. I thought, yes, that's much better than just dense. It's also intricate, so that we both agreed that it was so tightly woven, it was just about impossible to reduce it. He has these labyrinthine sentences, and you're going through it and you're trying to make it, trying to take excerpts so you can say it in your Gosh Darn podcast without going on forever. But he keeps adding things. And every time he adds, you think, oh, well, that's interesting. And you're like, okay, but that's the end. And he adds something else. You're like, oh, well, you can't take that out. And then he keeps adding. So you get these huge sentences, and at a certain point, you just cut bait and just do surgery and cut it out, because you can't just quote the pith, because it occurred to me, it's all pith.
It's all pith. Yeah, and I agree. And it doesn't seem like that, because it seems Baroque, and as I was suggesting when we were talking before, that these long sentences kind of unspool, but they're made up of threads that are all connected, quite precisely in most cases, I think, anyway.
It doesn't seem like excess at all.
It doesn't seem, it's very much compressed into, it's like one of those stars where each piece of it weighs like a ton, because it's so densely packed.
I thought you were going fractal at first, after the star within the star within the star. You're going through the text and you want to underline so much.
Oh, you said that, and I totally agree.
There's one big markup, and it reminded me of the old joke I remember from my school days, that maybe just highlight what's not important. And the way you put it, you summarized it here, was that part of the power of Democratic Vistas is Whitman's mode of expression, somewhat Baroque, completely sincere and utterly earnest. And there's something about the complexity of the language that doesn't make it seem like so much academic writing of, I would say, the last 50 years, or in my experience, which is Baroque and arcane and unclear, and seemingly designed not to make things clear, designed to make the author look smart.
Yeah.
Whitman is not doing it for that. He's not showing off. He's not starting. He's not trying to make himself look obscure or genius. He just is genius, I think, and that sometimes lends itself to a kind of obscurity. But he's trying to make himself clear, and you feel like you get in deep with him as you go.
Yeah, I think you can almost say he desperately wants to be clear. He wants to communicate. He wants people to get it. He does not want to dazzle people with his intellect and draw attention to himself. He wants to get his message across.
He's got something to say, and he wants you to get it.
He has something urgent to say.
And the part about sincerity and earnestness, those are the words that I thought of. Or I thought of sincerity too, and earnestness I thought was even better, because I was tempted to say there's no irony, and I thought, no, that's not quite right. But there's no cheap irony, and there's no sarcasm, and there's nothing that I would call snark. So Whitman, his writing, I thought, is like the antithesis of a tweet.
Mm.
Having said that, and having made all that praise, let's also admit that probably one out of every 3 sentences for me, you find yourself in the middle and you look around and you think, where the hell am I grammatically?
Yeah.
What was the subject? Well, have I gotten to the subject? Have I gotten to the verb? Does the subject have a verb? Is it a fragment? It seems like it never is. I think it's always a complete sentence, but you do get lost. So what I tell students, and this is a tip for people out there whose appetites have been whetted and you want to read some Walt Whitman, don't get discouraged and don't think that you need to understand it the first time, because if you think that, you're just going to quit. But what you do is you do what you do with Shakespeare. Now with Shakespeare, especially when he's writing his iambic pentameter, he's got to hold to the strictures pretty much of the meter, or Shakespeare does what Shakespeare wants. But partly because of that, he will change the order of words. He will put the verb before the subject, or tuck the verb at the very end, and he'll have a bunch of parenthetical phrases, or positive phrases between subject and verb. The way to deal with that, I think, at least the first move, is just define the subject and then define that subject's verb. If you can do that, you're in good shape. And sometimes you'll have to look for it, and sometimes you'll be surprised how far apart they are. But if you do that with Shakespeare or with Whitman, it will at least give you some sort of kind of anchor, someplace to stand, and you'll know what the real subject and the real action of that sentence is.
Yeah, so I think that's right, because when you read it, sometimes you'll think, wait a second, and you go back and you see, no, the sentence structure is logical.
Yeah.
Because there's so many parenthetical expressions that you have to go with him when he adds them, and then go get the actual verb that links them all together.
Right,
is in there.
Right. This is the thing. When I read Whitman to prepare for this, I got the feeling perpetually that I was just either too sleepy or just not quite smart enough to get it the first 2 or 3 times I read it. And I didn't mind it. I don't mind that when somebody leaves me behind because they're teaching so much so fast. It's like trying to drink out of a fire hose. That's okay, because I can go back and take another swallow. But when you're reading the other stuff, where it's just like they're trying to stretch you off and they're trying to leave you in the dust just so you come away thinking they're smart enough and sophisticated, that's off. That's not good teaching. So if you're patient with Whitman and you work with him, you can figure him out. Now, to give you one example, because we've praised him a lot, I will say that there are probably ways in which he could do a little better. Here's a sentence from pages 27A to 27B in my copy, of course. And I said before, he's like the anti-Twitter. Well, this one is only 298 characters. A tweet now can be up to 280, so you can almost fit this sentence in a tweet.
Okay.
But listen to the sentence, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to pause at every comma so you can hear where it is, and you'll see how challenging his language sometimes can be. And thus compared and tested, judging amid the influence of loftiest products only, what do our current copious fields of print, covering in manifold forms the United States, better, for an analogy, present than, as in certain regions of the sea, those spreading, undulating masses of squid, through which the whale swimming with head half out feeds? Question mark. That was probably hard to understand because I started to screw around in the middle, but it was funny.
But you started the sentence with thus, didn't you?
And thus. That's the
beginning. Really, you have to read the preceding.
That is true. That is true.
Yeah.
But I might put that one on the deets section just so you can see, because you've got like 3 or 4 different points where you've got one word in between commas.
Yeah.
And it's just it forces you to stop and start and go back. So anyway, I picked that one out. It was out of context. It was unfair. I'm sorry, Walt, but you kind of asked for it. Remember, what we're going to do is we're going to read some of his passages and his most kind of ecstatic, positive passages, and we're going to have fun doing it because his writing is so energetic and ebullient. And as we said, it does make sense almost, or maybe all of the time. So, but beware that it's not going to be an easy read. Don't read it when you're about to fall asleep.
It requires
you want just to fall asleep.
It requires focused attention. That's for sure.
All right, and hand the baton back to you, David. Thanks.
All right. Well, just along those lines, I thought I would read the first paragraph, maybe a part of the second and part of the third, for the stylistic quality of it, but also because Whitman introduces the themes that will be developed throughout the rest of the essay. And before I do that, one contextual item. There's a field of inquiry in English and cultural studies now called postcolonial studies, and that one fruitful way of looking at Democratic Vistas is a document of postcolonial thought, in that it's looking at a country that emerged from the British Empire through Revolutionary War, and almost a century later, Whitman is looking and saying, what is the status of the former colonies as an independent country? Yeah. And we see that after World War II, all these countries that became independent from their colonial dominators, seeking to define themselves in one way or another against that past. And Whitman is doing that too. I think you can see Democratic, this is taking stock, looking to the future, and saying, we're no longer colonial. What are we? So,
Well, what can we become?
and what can we become? So here's the first paragraph, and I'll just stop. I'll read some and I'll sort of comment a little bit. As the greatest lessons of nature through the universe are perhaps the lessons of variety and freedom, the same present the greatest lessons also in New World politics and progress. Now, that's an interesting sentence because Whitman is suggesting that the greatest lessons of nature, if you look at it, are variety and freedom.
Yeah.
Now, that's his opinion. You could also look at nature and say, well, the greatest lessons of nature are domination and struggle, or meaninglessness of the endless spheres as Pascal looked up at the skies. But to Whitman, the lessons are variety and freedom. He's inspired by nature in that way.
Yes.
And then he goes on to say, if a man were asked, for instance, the distinctive points contrasting modern European and American political and other life with the old Asiatic cultus, as lingering bequeathed yet in China and Turkey, he might find the amount of them in John Stuart Mill's profound essay on liberty in the future, where he demands two main constituents or substrata for a truly grand nationality. He's talking about John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty, which was a defense of democracy, and particularly of the kind of freedoms that are guaranteed by the American Bill of Rights, and particularly the First Amendment defending free speech.
And then the imperative of maintaining free speech
Yes.
and hearing contrary views,
Yes.
and allowing them to
Yes.
be voiced and actually being happy that they're voiced.
Yes.
If you haven't read On Liberty, at least read that, because that God, I wish everybody would read
Yeah,
that. I have read it for years. I went back to it.
It's
So you've got to listen to contrary views. One, you could be wrong, and you could learn something. Two, you could be right, but you could tighten up your game. And three, it could be a little bit of both, right? Seems like common
Yeah.
sense. But Mill is the one who articulated it
Yeah.
first, right?
And he says you can only be sure of your ideas by testing them against contrary ideas.
Yeah, they go flabby and ossify.
That's
You
right.
find yourself unable to defend them
Right.
if you don't have to, right?
Right.
So that's what you should be doing in life, and especially at a university.
Yeah. And Whitman in Democratic Vistas, he periodically will say, I know the question of democracy is an open one. He's not, he believes in the end that it's by far the best system, but he's willing to entertain the possibility that it is not, that it will be a failure in some, or at least in the United States, it will be a failure.
Yeah.
Anyway, Whitman says, demands two main constituents or substrata for a truly grand nationality. First, a large variety of character, and second, full play for human nature to expand itself in numberless and even conflicting directions. Seems to be for general, Whitman puts in parentheses, and seems to be for general humanity, much like the influences that make up in their limitless field that perennial health action of the air we call the weather, an infinite number of currents and forces and contributions and temperatures and cross purposes whose ceaseless play of counterpart upon counterpart brings constant restoration and vitality. With this thought, and not for itself alone, but all it necessitates and draws after it, let me begin my speculation. Well, what I find interesting about that is the metaphor of the weather. And Whitman says that the weather changes and therefore is helpful. It becomes not stagnant because of its constant motion. And he feels that that's a good metaphor for a society should always be in motion, that you progress. In some ways, it's a Hegelian idea that conflicting ideas are brought into contact with each other, and you get a synthesis that leads to a new idea, and you progressively move higher, at least in a new direction. The difference in the radical nature of this is that society, like I was mentioning earlier, Saudi Arabia with a constitution that would not agree at all that quality of a good society is that it allows for full play of human nature to expand itself in numberless and even conflicting directions. It would say no. And many of the societies of the Middle Ages certainly would feel the same way. They'd say, no, you don't want to expand in numberless conflicting directions. You want to expand in one direction laid out by certain theological principles and texts. And to deviate from that is sinful and destructive. But Whitman says no. He fervently believes, like Mill, that conflicting ideas lead to a kind of health in the same way that a change in the weather leads to a constant renewal.
And that doesn't mean it leads to a certain kind of easiness.
No, not at all.
Or even, how should I put it, as much order as you might want on a given day.
Yes.
But this is the kind of strain and sometimes pain and sometimes grief and frustration and uncertainty that you get with growth. And Whitman's all about that, and that's what you get with freedom. So we're carving out two different visions of, humanity and therefore government.
If you go with the weather metaphor, you're going to have some hurricanes.
Yeah.
You're going to have some floods.
Yeah.
You're going to have to accept those things. It has to rain in order for there to be, fruitful growth and so forth.
When you think of the wind or the air, you think of that as speech. That applies great.
Well, that's very good. That's very good. All right, the next sentence, just read a little bit. The next paragraph, I'll read a little bit of that comment. America, this is Whitman, America, filling the present with greatest deeds and problems, cheerfully accepting the past, including feudalism, as indeed the present is but the legitimate birth of the past, including feudalism, counts, as I reckon, for her justification and success, for who as yet dare claim success, almost entirely on the future. So Whitman is saying that this is an experiment, America. As of now, no one would dare, including him, say we have achieved a success as a culture or as a society. And he's looking almost entirely to the future, which is very interesting to read in 2022, because now we're 150 years out, so we can say, well, we're the future that he was thinking about. How are we doing? How are we doing?
Well, it seems just as precarious now, especially in 2022. And we'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
One of the questions that raises is, has this always been true in some sense?
Well,
is it in some sense necessary because of all the flux and uncertainty we talked about before? Because of the freedom, is this the strain, the tension, the Sturm und Drang that we always have?
Yeah.
And I'm sure it goes like this.
Yeah.
But in a way, it becomes reassuring because you think, look, he was worried about it 150 years ago, and we're worried about it now. But we made it through the last 150 years.
Well, there's always been a strain in almost every historical period to think the golden period was in the past. We're on the downhill slope and everything. But Whitman is thinking, he's optimistic about the future, but he's not, what would you call it? Certainly not smugly confident about the present at all.
Not complacent.
But as for the future, he goes on to say, nor is that hope unwarranted. Today, ahead, though dimly yet, we see in vistas a copious, sane, gigantic offspring.
Yeah, I love that line.
And there you have some of Whitman's very characteristic, some would say bombastic, but I think he has a very definite sense of what sane and gigantic are. Gigantic are sort of, mythically large, like the mythical, heroic in a sense.
Yes.
And sane is to him not, sort of an ordinary term of mental balance, but sane means fundamentally in balance at a very profound level.
And there are two things that just you don't expect to see those words used together.
You don't expect to see those. And then
copious, copious 30 for Luke too.
Yeah. It's big, but it's sane, but it's gigantic.
Yes.
And you don't see those together.
In offspring, you think of it, especially like gigantic offspring, it makes you think of Greek myth.
Yeah.
Where the next generation of God is going to gobble up the previous generation.
Yeah.
And especially if one comes out huge, you're like, holy shit, I'm going to take cover, he's going to eat me.
Well, I think that's right. I think he's thinking of that really almost.
Well, I guess you're right, but it's not only negative. It's like it's all, again, it's hanging in the balance of the possibility. This could be something that becomes better than the last generation, or it could be something that devours it. I want to jump in real quick and just point out we say vistas, or he says vistas here. And I think he said that in the text until just now. I thought it might be worth pointing out that if you just look it up on Webster's, it says the definition we all know, a large, beautiful view of land or water. So he's clearly thinking about that in the literal sense, but he's also thinking about it in the more intellectual, conceptual, spiritual sense as, quote, a large number of things possible in the future, which I think we all kind of have that. We think, that sounds right once we hear it, but I couldn't have given that definition.
That's a dictionary definition.
That's just Webster's. I find Webster's online to be helpful as a starting point.
Yeah. No, that's interesting that that's one of the meanings of it.
Yeah, well, it's vistas, a view, and what he's doing is to prophesy, right? And he's looking into the future.
Yeah, it's both a literal view, but also a view of an imagination of the of the future.
Yeah.
Well, he says, then he goes on to say, for our new world, I consider far less important for what it has done or what it is than for results to come. And of course, 150 years later, you say, well, Walt, soul, and this is really, debatable, but also, I think, very true in an important sense. He says, soul among nationalities. These states have assumed a task to put in forms of lasting power and practicality on areas of amplitude rivaling the operations of the physical cosmos, the moral political speculations of ages long, long deferred, the democratic republican principle, and the theory of development and perfection by voluntary standards and self-reliance.
Yeah.
Soul among the nationalities.
Yeah.
And I think he's right. If you look around the world at the time in 1871, that the United States is a country that is devoted, at least in theory, to the development of this democratic republican principle of perfection by voluntary standards.
Yeah.
There's not a church telling you what to do. There's not an ecclesiastical authority of different kinds. There's not a dictator or an emperor telling you what to do. It's perfection by voluntary standards and self-reliance. He said, who else, indeed, except the United States in history so far, have accepted an unwitting faith and, as we now see, stand, act upon, and go security for these things? And I think it's true that looking around the world at that time, going back to Auden, it's the idea that liberty is prior to virtue, that the fundamental principle is that people should be allowed to do what their inner being tells them to do. And if that turns out to have bad results, so be it. But you have to give them the chance to do that.
I was trying to find a passage that I can't find in time. I need paper, but where he says that one of the goals of a democracy, and this, I think, is a poor paraphrase, and his language is much more beautiful, but it touches on something you said, is to enable and to cultivate in each of its citizens the growing capacity for self-government.
Mm-hmm.
And so it connects with what you said about the voluntary, about it not being forced on you, about it being free, and we have this opportunity. But we can make it go to hell, or we can make it go to, well, the vistas that Walt likes most.
Right. Third paragraph, I'll just read a part of it. He said, but preluding no longer, let me strike the keynote of the following strain. First, premising that, though the passages of it have been written at widely different times, it is, in fact, a collection of memoranda, perhaps for future designers, comprehenders, which would be us. And though it may be open to the charge of one part contradicting another, for there are opposite sides to the great question of democracy as to every great question.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah.
That frame of mind that you recognize every great question is going to have conflicting opinions.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, he feels the parts harmoniously blended in my own realization and convictions, and present them to be read only in such oneness, each page and each claim and assertion modified and tempered by the others. Bear in mind, too, that they are not the result of studying up in political economy, but of the ordinary sense observing, wandering among men, these states, these stirring years of war and peace.
Yeah.
I will not gloss over the appalling dangers of universal suffrage in the United States. In fact, it is to admit and face these dangers that I am writing. To him or her within whose thought rages the battle, advancing, retreating between democracy's convictions, aspirations, and the people's crudeness, vices, caprices, I meanly write this essay.
Yeah.
And he's thinking about partly his response to an essay that had been written just a couple of years before this by Thomas Carlyle, a British conservative critic, who wrote an essay called Shooting Niagara in response to the Reform Bill of 1867 in England that had opened the franchise, not universally, but much wider than it had ever been opened before. And Carlyle thought this was a terrible mistake, that you were allowing this crude populace to have a hand in government was folly.
Yeah.
And Whitman is saying that, no, it's not folly, but he recognizes the power of Carlyle's argument that perhaps he's wrong. Perhaps it is, because if you look at the people, and we will read passages where Whitman looks at the character of the common culture of the time and finds it distinctly wanting.
Oh, yeah. Well, the passage you just read where he talked about how we have to be open to contradictory views and even to opposite views. I mean, there you see the Mill, John Stuart Mill. No one is forcing him to balance himself or to think, well, wait a minute, let's turn the coin over and see if the other side has an argument. He does that because he thinks it's right. He thinks it's good. He thinks it will lead him to truth. And with Carlyle, the passage, and I won't be able to find it, but we talked about this before the podcast, he talks about Carlyle's opinion, talks about how, at least at some point, it kind of enraged him. And he felt that there was nothing to it. But then he reined himself in and said, well, wait a minute. Then I stopped and I cooled down and I realized I sometimes feel that way too. Yeah. And just he got defensive of his nation. Now, ultimately, he sides against Carlyle, whom Whitman would call feudal, right? Feudal, aristocratic. And you say, no, I'm not about that. And you see what he says here about the common man. His thoughts are not going to be the result of studying up in political economy, but of the ordinary sense, observing, wandering among men, as he did, for example, when he served as a nurse. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's not just about the elite. So he hears the other side, he considers it, but he stands his ground. But he stands his ground more assuredly because it's survived a challenge.
Mm-hmm. And just to keep the idea of contradictions open, he makes this amazing statement about stakes of the United States success or not, in his view. Yeah. And he says the United States are destined either to surmount the gorgeous history of feudalism or else prove the most tremendous failure of time.
Yeah, but no pressure. Right. Well, that passage and the one you read before, where he says, I won't gloss over the appalling dangers of universal suffrage. I don't know how young people are in the audience, but now he's talking about suffrage. He means the vote. He's saying, look, there are dangers, not just ordinary dangers, but appalling dangers of universal suffrage. And in 2022, pretty much wherever you are on the political spectrum in the United States, you can empathize. You can say, I've seen some appalling uses of suffrage recently, and you can tell I'm trying to be totally generic about it. But Democrats can see that. Republicans can feel
That's
that,
great.
and everybody in between can feel that too, because we all think, holy crap, this is what we voted for. So I'm not going to take sides on that, because that's not the point
That's
of the
a great
podcast.
point. That's a great point. Well, there seems to be more today than during my lifetime at any time, and I'm 75 now. But the one side thinks the other side, it's just an appalling thing that they get to vote at all.
Yes.
And the other side feels the same way about, the left feels the same way about the right. Why are these people allowed to even vote?
Yeah.
It's sort of, I think, a very strong feeling among the extremes that make up a fairly large proportion of the population.
That's actually one of the reasons that I do the podcast, is that I want people who disagree. I want to read people who disagree, authors who disagree with one another. And I just want to try to model listening and learning and being intellectually humble without racing to declare someone right or wrong. And that's what we need in the country, because the sides that look at the other side and think those guys are whack, they're crazy, they shouldn't have the vote. It seems to be getting to the point that some of them mean it, and that's a real danger. And that is
that's right.
kind of the most appalling danger that I sense. And so that's why we're reading this book now. That's why you picked it out. You thought this relates to 2022 because we feel this kind of hanging in the balance in a way that is precarious and scary.
Yeah. Well, moving on a little bit, for people who are not so literarily inclined, they might be shocked by Whitman's rather extravagant claims for the power of literature. And of course, he being a poet, he thinks poetry is the supreme of the arts. But I'll just read a section where he makes his claims for literature. And then we can talk about what we might think he means by literature. He says, viewed today from a point of view sufficiently overarching, the problem of humanity all over the civilized world is social and religious, and is finally to be met and treated by literature. The priest departs, the divine literatus comes. Never was anything more wanted than today, and here in the States, the poet of the modern is wanted, or the great literatus of the modern. At all times, perhaps, the central point in any nation, and that whence it is itself really swayed the most, and whence it sways others, is its national literature, especially its archetypal poems. Above all previous lands, a great original literature is surely to become the justification and reliance, in some respects, the sole reliance of American democracy. And you think, whoa, that's a pretty large claim for literature, which many people do not even read.
Walt making a large claim.
But then he goes on to give examples which seem to support the point of view, at least partly. Few are aware how the great literature penetrates all, gives hue to all, shapes aggregates and individuals, and after subtle ways with irresistible power, constructs, and postmodernists will like that word, constructs, sustains, demolishes at will. Why tower in reminiscence above all the nations of the earth, two special lands, petty in themselves, yet inexpressibly gigantic, beautiful, columnar. Immortal Judah lives, and Greece immortal lives in a couple of poems. And he's referring to the Bible, and he's referring to the works of Homer and Plato and Aristotle and the Greek tragedians. And he's saying that these countries, Greece was a tiny, petty city-states, and Judah only existed for maybe one or two generations and was swallowed up by, I think, the Assyrian Empire. I can't remember which empire it was, conquered Judah. And yet the cultural power that they had is pretty undeniable to this day.
So those are some of my favorite passages. I love it when he goes all in. And of course, I love literature too. Now,
well, and Joe teaching great books. I mean, what could be a more potent defense of the great books than to say, they are what governs life at the deepest levels, even thousands of years on.
And I don't believe it for a minute, but I still think it's fun. I'm like, go Walt. But the ambition is what I love, and that in the first podcast I talked about how ambitious the great authors have been. And I should point out one thing. When I first read this, I love this sentence. First, because it's only 7 words long. That's probably the shortest one in the book. But just because it's so, audacious. The priest departs, the divine literatus comes. And the first time I read it, I thought two things. One, that's cool. And what the hell is a literatus? It's the singular of literati, right? So essentially it means the kind of writer he's looking for, I think. But what he expects of these great authors is nothing short of, unadulterated ambition. He says on this is page 2A, and I think, so we're on page 2 in my book, or my copy of it, so that's where David is. He says, I say that democracy can never prove itself beyond cavil until it founds and luxuriantly grows its own forms of art, poems, schools, theology, displacing all that exists or that has been produced anywhere in the past under opposite influences. So as David notes, he goes on to spend a lot of time hailing the ancient Hebrews and Greeks for their literature and for good reason. But here's the hilarious part. He does it. He builds them up only so and say America's going to do better than that. So he says, and let's see, I'm skipping, I think, all the way to page 16a here. He says, ye powerful and resplendent ones. He's talking to the ancient Greeks and Hebrews here. Immortal Judah, as he says, could ye indeed but breathe your breath of life into our new world's nostrils? He seems to be doing Genesis there, where Yahweh God breathes life into Adam by breathing into his nostrils, the breath of life. He says, do that to breed a spirit like your own. Because remember, he's saying, look, we haven't done shit yet in America as far as literature. I mean, Melville's saying, ouch. And Walt Whitman, as David pointed out to me before the podcast, Whitman seems to have a certain poet in mind as the one who can pull this off. And his name rhymes with,
bring up Melville.
Whitman.
That's a good point, because Moby Dick was published in 1851,
I looked that up.
20 years before, and Whitman was aware of Melville. He was aware of Saipi and Omu, Melville's most popular early works. Okay. But he doesn't, to my knowledge, he doesn't mention Moby Dick anywhere. Maybe he does, but I've never seen it.
You talk about the anxiety of influence, which this is a concept by Harold Bloom, a guy I read when I teach Shakespeare, a Shakespeare critic. And I can't remember exactly how it goes, but for today it's enough to say just that there's a strong rivalry between authors and people that they consider to be, the previous great authors that were most influential to them. And so there's kind of a, there's a competition, a Cain and Abel or an Oedipal contest between them, and that the one author has to kind of outdo or slay the previous author's father author in order to become who he is fully. So total speculation, but maybe that's why Melville isn't named here as, someone who's done a good job.
It's possible, but I think poor Moby Dick was, it wasn't well received, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, it was well received by a few critics, but mostly it was not understood, and it didn't do. Melville had bestsellers with Type B and Omu.
Ah, I didn't know that.
And he had pretty good sales with Redburn and White Jacket. And Moby Dick was it was too big, too complicated, much not of its time. But what's now considered maybe the greatest American novel was already written when Whitman is writing, and Whitman writes as if it doesn't exist.
Well, in a couple points I made in that first podcast, often you don't recognize the greatness of a work right off. By you, I mean the culture, the world, or whoever reads it doesn't recognize that. Yeah, and that's why that's why I don't teach any author that has been dead for 50 or 100 years, just because you want to let things settle. But that passage I mentioned, I interrupted myself about. If Greece and ancient Immortal Judah could just breathe a spirit like yours into our own and quicken us, bring us to life. He says. The implication is we could write great literature too, but the passage continues like this. He says, if you could breathe a spirit like your own in us, perhaps, parenthesis, dare we say it, to dominate, even destroy what you yourselves have left. So Shakespeare gets his too. He mentions the great poems. Shakespeare, this is a quote from 16a, are poisonous to the idea of the pride and dignity of the common people, because Shakespeare is part of the old feudal order. Although Shakespeare, of course, is like a Whitman who was not educated at the best places, came out of nowhere. Stratford, where the hell is Stratford? And dominated. So again, this might be a little bit of the anxiety of influence, but he says they're poisons to the idea of pride, dignity of the common people, the lifeblood of democracy. The models of our literature, as we get it from other lands, ultramarine, have had their birth in courts and basked and grown in castle sunshine. All smells of princes' favors. Do you call those genteel little creatures American poets? I think I hear echoed as from some mountaintop afar in the west, the scornful laugh of the genius of these states. So you think back to that first episode, and I told you, biatches, the great authors are predators. They do not kiss up. They devour. They're precursors. That's how they're great. It's this unbridled ambition.
And of course, in 1871, Whitman he was 16 years on from his first publication of Leaves of Grass, which he had great hopes for, and which in some ways exemplifies the kind of poem that he's calling for here.
Yes.
Although he realized that by this point that he was never going to be a great popular poet in the sense of wide sales, although he became fairly widely.
Was he later?
Yeah. And he was, ironically, he was read probably more widely in England than he was in.
Well, that's kind of funny.
In the United States,
because Carlyle's like, told you, they're not smart enough to appreciate you there, but we effete genteel authors and literati in the old feudal world, we get you.
Oscar Wilde was a great devotee of Whitman. He thought he was a great poet. And later on, D.H. Lawrence says that's
totally unsurprising.
Whitman is. Lawrence says Whitman is the only poet.
Oh,
he said Whitman is the only one who staked out the new ground that I want to follow.
Lawrence, you can see how he was inspired by him. I mean, he constantly, the only thing I remember about him is from like Women in Love, and he's constantly talking about black electric lightning shooting up my thighs, Goodrich thighs. Anyway, I forget how it goes, but he gets ecstatic, so to speak. And wild, of course, too. These are free-flowing, romantic, unbridled.
Although it's interesting, as much as Lawrence admired Whitman and really was, worshipped him in a sense, he also made fun of him. And he made fun of the democratic ethos because Lawrence was not a Democrat. Okay. Lawrence was a conservative in that sense. He felt that democracy was a kind of a scam and a sham.
There's a predatory aspect to it too. You don't bow down if you're a great books author. You don't bow down to your precursors. You surmount them.
He bowed down, and then now I'll distance myself.
You pay your respects, and
then you move on.
Then you take their heads.
Here's a point I think is important to bring up is Whitman's notion of identity and union, which, as we've talked about, are very much threatened today. Both an American identity has come under great skeptical criticism because some critics would argue there is no American identity. There's only sub-hyphenated Americans. There's either African American or Asian American or white American. And Whitman he's trying to describe what an American identity would be, and also what glue would hold a union together. And today, of course, we see the union being threatened. And here's how he explains it. Nothing is plainer than the need, a long period to come, of a fusion of the states into the only reliable identity, the moral and artistic one. Mm-hmm. For, I say, the true nationality of the states, the genuine union, when we come to a mortal crisis, is and is to be, after all, neither the written law nor, as is generally supposed, either self-interest or common pecuniary or material objects, but the fervid and tremendous idea, melting everything else with resistless heat and solving all lesser indefinite distinctions in vast, indefinite spiritual, emotional power.
Classic Whitman.
Yeah,
off the rails.
That reminds me of a thing that I discussed with Joe earlier, was a quotation from F. Scott Fitzgerald at the end of The Great Gatsby, which is sometimes considered one of the archetypal American novels, that America was born of a Platonic conception, the only country that was born from a Platonic conception of itself. Yeah. And Whitman is really saying that. He's saying the only thing that holds Americans together is this idea, common devotion to democratic principle of perfection by voluntary standards. Yes. And if people stop believing in that and start believing in tribal, older, more traditional and kind of identities that have existed through most of human history, tribal identities, the nation will fall apart. It will disintegrate.
Yeah, when you brought that up from Gatsby, I'd forgotten about it. And when you quoted it, I remember thinking, oh, perfect. Whitman would love that. Whitman would have loved that. And it fits so perfectly because, like, you're talking about the things that hold us together. And it occurred to me just now while you're saying that I think Whitman would like this. That what holds us together is the radical freedom that this country is supposed to afford. Yes. For us all to be our own radical individual selves. And part of that would be the hyphenated Americans. That's part of your identity. Yeah. But insisting that that's all there is, right? And it's just tribes. He would say, no, it's not that. It's that we're united by so much more, and we're united by freedom and also by this idea of America. And back to the institutions, I forget what you said that sparked this, but it's just that the question, this goes back to Eden in Milton. Mm-hmm. Eve, when she is rationalizing an excuse to eat from a tree, she says, look, Adam, don't be such a fuddy-duddy. Let me go out and garden by myself, take this risk. Why? Because God would not have made Eden so frail that we could dissolve it by one mistake. And she says, Eden were no Eden if this be so. And the obvious truth, of course, is that no, Eden is frail. And you can pick it up if you want to. So go ahead and do it, and it'll happen. And then you take that to America. It's the same principle, and that's why America is kind of an Eden. It's not an Eden in the sense that it's a paradise. Yeah. It's an Eden in the sense that it is a possible paradise, and one that could be, as the title goes, lost. Yeah. And nowadays it seems like people, they rail against the institutions, and I rail against them too, but you can't rail against them and think that they should solve all our problems. And the institutions, impersonal machines or rules, somehow make the country great. You're the institution. You can be the institution. You can drive us off the cliff, or you can drive straight. And that's why it hangs in the balance, right? Democracy it allows us to make this nation what we want it to be. And we can make it, well, to put it simplistically, we can make it good or we can make it bad.
It's a good point. It's related to that, I guess, in this one sense, the idea of the melting pot. That's become a very common term, and has been replaced recently by the concept or the idea of the salad bowl, the metaphor of the salad bowl. The melting pot imagines melting individual identities or subcultures into one new, metal.
Yeah.
But the syllable is still a unity in that it's a salad, but it has different identifiable parts to it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Whitman uses the words, but the fervent and tremendous idea, melting everything else with resistless heat.
Yeah.
And some people today would argue that they don't want to be melted into one American identity. They want to maintain the hyphenated identity, or they want to maintain the hyphen identity, as you say, as part of their identity, and also have this sort of larger American identity. Although in some quarters, the idea of a larger American identity is specifically attacked as oppressive, as squelching or smothering sub-identities.
And that's where Whitman would probably draw the line, right? And he would say, absolutely, be a blank American. That's your heritage. That's part of your identity. Celebrate that. I'll celebrate that with you. But don't, refuse to be part of the whole. And with the melting pot, I've always thought that if you take it to mean that you're being melted down like molten slag, and that your individuality is being reduced, that's not America. That's that's a different kind of government, right? That's no offense. That's China. Or at least China's more like that than we have the possibility to be here. So I don't think anyone ever meant it that way, that we all want to be melted down to the same undifferentiable slag.
Right. Well, and the idea that he's talking about taking over, the melting is, in a good sense, you could say the melting is into this people who look at each other and respect each other's rights to be who they want to be.
Yes.
And therefore, that idea is actually an idea of freedom rather than an idea of imposing any particular scheme of beliefs on a people. So that it depends which idea you're, sort of melted into. If you're, again, using the Saudi Arabian example, the idea would be the idea of Islam. And in China would be the idea of what the party says is the way we should do things.
Yes.
In the U.S., at least as Whitman sees it, the idea is the idea of perfection by voluntary standards, which allows you to have the identity that you want to have.
Yeah.
But still, the way he expresses it, some people would probably resist that formulation.
And it's not, I don't mean to say that the U.S. has not, made that mistake. I mean, absolutely, there's always that drive by the majority to melt down the rest and make them uniform or to make them quiet.
And a classic case would be the Indian schools that the government promoted, where they tried to literally melt down the local culture of tribes and impose this common American culture, getting rid of the original language, the original beliefs, the original ways of doing things.
The Pope just apologized for that.
And the Pope apologized for doing that very thing. And the question is, can you have a society that respects subcultures and allows them to flourish while maintaining an overall respect among them? Or they conflict to such a degree? Because in some ways, cultural practices are going to conflict. And my cultural practice is going to interfere with your cultural practice. And there has to be another level above those two that resolves that conflict in one way or another.
But the tension is healthy. It keeps you on your toes. It's in a way a challenge. And it's also a reminder, right, that this is the way the United States ought to be. That
it's healthy, but it also can be in the same way that someone who is undisciplined and does everything and doesn't choose a path ends up leading to sort of an unhealthy life. It's tricky. It's a tricky idea. And countries all over the world today are trying to deal with subcultures within them. A country like Nigeria, which has 3 major tribal areas, the threat to the idea of Nigeria is the deeper cultural identity.
Yeah, well, Whitman keeps talking about the late secession war, right? So
exactly. And the South looked on that war as the war for Southern independence, is the way it was referred to. They thought, who are they to melt us into this idea of the Union? We want to be a subculture of our own.
This a friend of mine, and he's a good guy, friend of mine. He kind of laughed when he said it, but in high school, this is in the late 80s, he was taught that they didn't call it the Civil War, they called it the War of Northern Aggression. And so you see, where the concern that Whitman has at the beginning, he says, look, I'm writing for you people that are worried about the future of the United States, because I'm right there with you. I'm worried about it too. And that speaks to us in 2022. But we have to hope that the tension is fruitful and ultimately healthy. And we need to resist the urge to try to stomp out all dissent. And that trend, it seems to me, is trending in the wrong direction on college campuses. People are so worried about offense that they want to stifle dissent rather than embrace dissent and learn from dissent and celebrate dissent. And that's what should be happening on a college campus.
It's interesting, that example of the South, because you could think of the South as a subculture. That's what they, in contemporary terms, the South was wanting to assert its own sub-identity. We're Southerners. We're Southern Americans, we're American, but we're Southern. And to a certain point, the white people of the South, not all of them, but most of them, felt that the subculture was more important than the larger culture. And so, if you're defending subcultures, this case of Civil War is a tough one, because most people who would defend subcultures not being absorbed into a larger American culture today would look back at the Civil War and say, well, but the North was right to fight the Civil War in order to free the slaves. So it's a very difficult question. The larger whole.
In the U.S., you come back to the Constitution or the principles that were nascent in the Constitution, and so there's a point at which, when you have conflicting values, a point at which, in some cases, some values have to yield. In this case, the subcultures, thank God, yielded to the inherent dignity and freedom of every individual in the nation, regardless of race.
Yeah. But in the Civil War, it took violence to. The conflict was not resolved until. And Southerners felt at the end of the war, well, this American idea has been imposed on us, and we're being melted back into a union that we don't want.
Well, and you taught me something about grammar, about usage.
Yes.
Right. So before the war, we would say the United States are, and after the war, people would say the United States.
Although it's interesting that Whitman, at least in one of the passages, still uses the United States are. And it might have been written earlier than the Civil War, because these are written at different times.
But the change over time, of course,
yes,
it seems to be around the Civil War, and it makes perfect sense that at that point we would start saying is. Right.
Yeah.
The Union won.
And today you have, it's not so much it is by states, red states, blue states.
Yeah.
There's this identity where states, red states, blue states, purple states. That's really a fundamental quality of their identity in a way it hasn't been until, at least in my mind, until recently.
Yeah. Well, and with a recent Supreme Court ruling, the states are going to be different in very
that's true.
consequential ways.
That's
and so it's all the more important for us to recognize that that's how, in a sense, I'm not talking about the particular issue, but because I have my own opinion about the issue, but in a sense, that's how the United States are supposed to be. The states are supposed to have a substantial freedom within this larger whole.
But that's a really good example for subcultures. You could say the Supreme Court has made a decision on the basis of the power or the autonomy of subcultures, that they should not all be melted into this this idea. Each region should decide for itself on this very important issue. And yet the people who, they find themselves on odd sides of the question on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's in a way, it's a challenge to both sides, because neither side is totally happy.
Yeah.
The side that the pendulum swung toward is happier.
Yeah.
But I think at a certain point, what you're going to find is that they're going to say, wait a minute, we're not satisfied with that. That's not really what we meant. This wasn't a states' rights issue. This was a different issue.
That's right. Very interesting point, the way that came up. Well, we can just move along just because it would be fun to read. If you think that Whitman is a Pollyanna and you think that he thinks the United States is great and that, it's already achieved kind of superiority, not so. Because he says, here's some fun sentences. He says, I say we had best look our times and lands searchingly in the face like a physician diagnosing some deep disease. Never was there perhaps more hollowness at heart than at present in here in the United States. Genuine belief seems to have left us. The underlying principles of these states are not honestly believed in for all this hectic glow and these melodramatic screamings, nor is humanity itself believed in. What penetrating eye does not see everywhere through the mask? The spectacle is appalling. We live in an atmosphere of hypocrisy throughout. The men believe not in the women, nor the women in the men. A scornful superciliousness rules in literature. The aim of all the literateurs is to find something to make fun of. A lot of churches, sects, etc., the most dismal phantasms I know usurp the name of religion. Conversation is a massive baggage. From deceit in the spirit, the mother of all false deeds, the offspring is already incalculable. Then a little further on, he says, the best class we show is but a mob of fashionably dressed speculators and vulgarians. True indeed, behind this fantastic farce enacted on the visible stage of society, solid and stupendous labors have been discovered, existing crudely and going on in the background to advance and tell themselves in time. Yet the truths are nonetheless terrible. He's not blind to the shortcomings of democratic society as it existed.
Yeah, and that's one of the passages I read, and
at that time.
I was disappointed to recognize the 2022 United States. At least I look at it in certain moods.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Whitman is to Carlyle, like, oh, okay, I'm defensive of my nation, but wait a minute, sometimes I think that too. And this is what is dismaying genuine belief seems to have left us. And you could apply that to all sorts of different spheres of life, not just religion, but as he says in the next sentence, governance. The underlying principles of the states are not honestly believed in, nor is humanity itself believed in. That's devastating. The men believe not the women, nor the women in the men. I mean, ouch.
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that is, I mean, it's a cliche now that we are losing faith in our institutions.
Yeah.
And it's in the point I made before is one of the most dire aspects of that is that we are separating ourselves from our institutions, from the idea of the institutions. Those institutions are us, ultimately, or the people that we vote to represent us.
Well, against his pessimism and his looking around at what actually is the case and seeing that the gigantic personalities that he wants to emerge from democratic soil have not emerged. Against that, he cites the character and the great courage and soul that he saw among the average soldiers in the Civil War when he was acting as a nurse in the hospitals.
Yeah.
And Joe and I were talking earlier, the hospitals in the Civil War were particularly horrible because the weapons of war had advanced far beyond the skills of medical practitioners. And so you have a time in history when the weapons of destruction are very great, but the means of treating wounds and injuries are in their very primitive state. We were discussing earlier that germ theory had not come into being. The idea of cleanliness, the idea of sterile conditions for treatment of wounds and injuries did not exist. Yeah. So the hospitals were essentially dirty, germ-ridden, and the main mode of treatment was amputation, and the greatest surgeons were considered the ones that could do it the fastest, who could get it cut off and staunched before the patient died of shock. Yeah. So under those conditions, Whitman sees these young men who also experienced horrible conditions in the battlefield, and he observed their deep character. And here's a very moving passage, I think, where he describes why this character can underlie his faith in democracy, because if these people are the common people, then eventually the greatness that's in them will emerge if given the chance. He says, the movements of the late secession war and their results, to any sense that studies well and comprehends them, show that popular democracy, whatever its faults and dangers, practically justifies itself beyond the proudest claims and wildest hopes of its enthusiasts. Perhaps no future age can know, but I well know, how the gist of this fiercest and most resolute of the world's warlike contentions resided exclusively in the unnamed, unknown rank and file, and how the brunt of its labor of death was, to all essential purposes, volunteered. The people of their own choice, fighting, dying for their own idea, insolently attacked by the secession slave power, and its very existence imperiled. Descending to detail, entering any of the armies and mixing with the private soldiers, we see and have seen august spectacles. We have seen the alacrity with which the American-born populace, the peaceablest and most good-natured race in the world, and the most personally independent and intelligent, and the least fitted to submit to the irksomeness and exasperation of regimental discipline, sprang at the first tap of the drum to arms, not for gain, nor even glory, nor to repel invasion, but for an emblem, a mere abstraction, for the life, the safety of the flag. We have seen the unequaled docility and obedience of these soldiers. We have seen them tried long and long by hopelessness, mismanagement, and by defeat. We have seen the incredible slaughter toward or through which the armies, as at first Fredericksburg and after the Wilderness, still unhesitatingly obeyed orders to advance. We have seen them entrench or crouching behind breastwork, or tramping in deep mud, or amid pouring rain or thick falling snow, or under forced marches in hottest summer, as on the road to get to Gettysburg. Vast suffocating swarms, divisions, corps, with every single man so grimed and black with sweat and dust, his own mother would not have known him, his clothes all dirty, stained and torn, with sour accumulated sweat for perfume. Many a comrade, perhaps a brother, sunstruck, staggering out, dying by the roadside of exhaustion. Yet the great bulk, bearing steadily on, cheery enough, hollow-bellied from hunger, but sinewy with unconquerable resolution.
Yeah. This is for people playing at home, at least in the copy I have, 9A to 9B, and then actually all the way on to 10A. And there's some short passages that, if you'll permit me, I'll read because I think they help what you're saying. There have we watched these soldiers, many of them only boys in years, marked their decorum, their religious nature and fortitude, and their sweet, affection. But I realize that it is finally from what I learned personally, mixing in such scenes, that I am now penning these pages. So in a way, this is kind of the center, the heart, or the source, the seed of this Democratic Vistas track. And so he talks about a particular night. He says, as I stood by the bedside of a Pennsylvania soldier who lay conscious of quick approaching death, yet perfectly calm and with noble spiritual manner. He goes on to say, he talked to another soldier who said he had not yet seen the first case of man or boy that met the approach of dissolution with cowardly qualms or terror. Now that's beautiful. It can't possibly be true.
Yeah.
But it shows you what inspires Whitman. He says that my observation fully bears out the remark. He finishes by saying, what have we here? If not towering above all talk and argument, the plentifully supplied, last needed proof of democracy in its personalities. And he says every bit as much from the South as from the North. Now think about that. He wasn't neutral, right? He was firmly on the side of the Union. But even in this moment, he's acknowledging nobility on the side of the enemy. Am I putting it too far there about his support for the Union?
No, absolutely not. No, he was a fervent supporter of the Union.
Good. And then the last sentence of that paragraph is 10b in my text is, let no tongue ever speak in disparagement of the American races, North or South, the one who has been through the war in the great army hospitals. That lands with a boom.
I have seen critics not make fun of, but have been somewhat sarcastic toward his view, saying, well, this is an idealized view of the soldiers. And in some sense, you say there were obviously exceptions.
Yes.
But he's saying that what he saw, and he was there, in these average, often, probably illiterate men who fought in the war, he saw a quality of soul that can serve as a substratum of the philosophy of democracy.
Exactly.
There's greatness enough in people that if you allow them to show what they've got, and unfortunately the way they showed it was in war, they will bloom in some way.
Yeah, and you made the point perfectly. Yeah, and I as I was reading, I said, now look, there had to be exceptions, right? But that's not really the point. I mean, surely he goes too far when he says that, and he doesn't say there wasn't any, but he says that he met a guy who said he hadn't seen it, and says he hadn't seen it. So maybe that's the truth, as you say, they were there. But what really matters is that there were a lot of men who rose to that occasion and lived in that way and died in that way. And the way he introduces this is he's saying, look, I want to dig into that phrase, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, right? From the lips of Abraham Lincoln. So he's talking about the Gettysburg Address, which you talked about Gettysburg in the passage you read, Whitman did. Next paragraph, he exalts the people, capital P exclamation part. He says, viewed in the lump, as, in the whole, without looking at them as individuals, this pleases and is a constant puzzle and affront to the merely educated classes. Seems to have guys like Carlyle in mind here. He says, the rare cosmical artist mind, lit with the infinite, capital I, alone confronts his manifold and oceanic qualities, talking about the people in general, I think. But taste, intelligence, and culture, so-called, have been against the masses and remain so. What he's saying here is that this is the new American artist, someone who is good enough to embrace the panoply, this diversity of all these millions of individuals, and do what I would say Chaucer did best in Canterbury Tales. I think that's the best I've seen of it. So he's calling for an American Chaucer, and I think he's got a certain poet in mind who he thinks can do it pretty well.
Yeah, although he never, unlike Chaucer, who wrote about very vivid, specific personalities, Whitman never. He has little vignettes in his poem of people.
Well, you talked about the women, right?
Yeah, I mean, and you could see he could be, if he wanted to. Yeah. In his there's 3 or 4 little vignettes of roles of modern women that are very moving, but he often rises to the level of generality rather than focusing like a novelist would on particular characters.
Yeah, he's very abstract.
Yeah, he's
really
but it's interesting that he that war is and in this way it almost goes back to the Iliad in some ways. The war, unfortunately, seems to be, and why people throughout history have been both appalled by it and attracted to it, is that it's a way to reveal the deepest qualities of a person. You're tested by war, so that your true self comes out. There's no I worked with a guy who had been in Vietnam, and he had been a medic on helicopters, and they had landed and picked up people under fire and brought them back to the hospital, and he re-enlisted against his wife's wishes.
Wow!
Because he said that he never felt as alive or as leading as meaningful a life as he was doing that, and that afterwards everything seemed a little pale in comparison.
I've heard that.
And so it's Whitman is saying it's war that brings out this quality, but you would hope that other conditions could also allow these qualities to emerge. But there's a lot of evidence that soldiers will talk about war experiences being, if they didn't break them, it was an experience that brought out a stronger.
Yeah.
And people have read, people talking about their friendships they made during the war deeper than any friendships they could make outside of that arena.
I certainly have no experience with that, but I have read and seen documentaries or interviews where people in person have said all of that. And it seems to me that it all makes sense, but it's often in a tragic way.
Yeah.
It also seems to me that the kind of tumult and stress and strain and competition that the U.S. has because of its pluralism and its freedom. Maybe that could be something of a surrogate for that, or a substitute for that. It would keeps you alive, keeps you on your toes, gives you something to contend with. But the trick, of course, is to stop it from turning into war.
Yeah,
and that's what the life of the mind really ought to be. Yeah. We talked before about reading is like a gymnast activity, right? School should be like that. Conversation should be like that. Just don't punch anybody.
Speaking of gymnasts, I was thinking that sports have such a big role in American life because they seem to be a place where combat is allowed, but the outcome is not known. There's no prescribed. So you really feel when you're watching. That's why fixing a sports event seems like such a base thing to do, because it's one of the last places where you can see honest, fervent competition, and you see true character emerge, true heroism, emerging, and it has such a powerful effect on sports heroes of the NBA or the NFL, less so of baseball now, but definitely those two sports, basketball and football. To young people, they are incredibly potent, and consequently, they are rewarded. It didn't used to be, but now rewarded with massive amounts of money because of the particular cultural importance they have.
Yeah, well, everything you just said is the reason I think MMA has become so big, because it's not just sports.
Yeah, it's
like hit them in the face and kick them, or you can kick them and choke them out, and bloody them. And I'm a fan of MMA, but even for me, sometimes it's kind of like, but it's the primal, the most primal form of competition you can get to, short of war or short of a fight in the alley that goes to death. And that's why I think it has such gravity.
Yeah.
But that's it's a good way for the society to let off steam, especially for people like me who just watch it and don't actually get in the ring with
it's a
monster.
I think that's one of the reasons that it's become more and more potent, is that it's a place where you get to see the kind of revelation of character that Whitman is talking about in the actual Civil War. But you see a game come down and you see who's going to rise to the occasion. And you like to see people rise to the occasion because it's inspiring.
And especially in MMA, you often see the fighters. You can see the respect at the end of the fight. At the end of the fight, during the fight, but not all of them.
Yeah,
Nate Diaz probably won't show you any respect in the fight. But even he and McGregor, and they're one of their two famous fights, they clearly seemed begrudgingly to respect each other, because they could tell that the other guy was feeling exactly the way they were, precarious, on the edge of surrender, on the edge of defeat, and still digging down deep in a way that almost nobody else can do. To fight, a real life fight.
I only followed. It's funny. I followed it on the women's side. For some reason, I got interested in the Holly Holm. Who's the person she beat?
Ronda Rousey?
Yes. And I didn't watch the fight in real time. I was reading articles later, and I thought this is interesting. And you can go online and watch the actual fight. And it was there was something so real about it.
Huge upset. At least by perception. In hindsight, I don't think it should have been that big a surprise.
But it was so vivid and real, and the sense of victory and defeat was so potent that I was really drawn to it. And I remember I saw Holly Holm being interviewed on Larry King shortly after that, and Larry King said, she's a very intelligent, very articulate person, very attractive.
She has a soft little voice, squeaky voice,
very attractive in a conventional way, and you can see Larry King is kind of like incredibly impressed with her. And finally, he just says, "Why do you do this?" And she kind of looks at him, and she can't quite explain it, but it's partly because of this. It's the only way she can reveal her true self to herself is by getting in the ring, and fighting and either winning or losing.
It's pushing yourself to your limits. They say it's a cliche, but when they do it, it's not cliche. Whitman would say that's absolute solitary individuality in the ring.
Yeah.
And it does get kind of gruesome. And for people who watch MMA, I took my kid when he was too young to go. I finally took him to an MMA fight. It was the fight where Anderson Silva wrapped his leg around Chris Weidman's leg. I just couldn't believe it. Was like the most gruesome thing that I'd ever seen. He didn't just break it against you check it and block it with his shin, and it was a kick. And his leg went like silly, like this around. I was like, I can't believe how I get to this. So it didn't do it for another, handful of years. Wait until I got older than that. But he had younger brothers, so I took him to the other fight. I can't remember the guy's names, but I'll have to put it in the deeds. But anyway, that fight was in its own way just as brutal, and it was like one of the quickest fights ever. So anyway, shame on me. There are certain things that are so kind of primal. Rush to wait until your kids are older before you take them. I won't tell you how old they are. You can just wonder. Where were we in Walt Whitman?
Well, we were talking about heroism and the qualities of courage that were revealed in the soldiers.
And
we're talking about modern day sort of substitutes for that. But one would hope that there were also other avenues that would bring out that.
I guess sorry. So do you have any things that you haven't come up or that you really wanted to say or passages you wanted to read? I kind of wanted to read some, like my attempt at summarizing the whole thing just to give a little bit more structure for people who want to go read.
Sure.
And then there was at least one passage that I wanted to read, I guess, kind of toward the end, because it seemed to me, again, just really relevant to Whitman and Whitman as a writer in the Great Books tradition.
I guess in all fairness, we should bring out, the parts of Whitman that would strike people today differently than they would have struck. And I can bring up my own case as a kid of the 1950s, that I read this passage much differently now than I would have read it then.
Okay.
And this is a passage where Whitman really pretty much expresses in a very articulate way the concept of manifest destiny for the United States.
Yes.
And here it says, he says, in a few years, the dominion heart of America will be far inland toward the west. Our future national capital may not be where the present one is.
Yeah.
It is possible, nay likely, that in the 50 years, it will migrate 1,000 or 2 miles. It will be refounded, and everything belonging to it made on a different plan, original, far more superb. The main social, political spine character of the states will probably run along the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi rivers, and west and north of them, including Canada. Those regions, with the group of powerful brothers toward the Pacific, destined to the mastership of that sea and its countless paradise of islands, will compact and settle the traits of America with all the old retained, but more expanded, grafted on newer, hardier, purely native stock. A giant growth, composite from the rest, getting their contribution, absorbing it, to make it more illustrious. From the north, intellect, the sun of things, also the idea of unswayable justice, anchor amid the wildest tempests. From the south, the living soul, the animus of good and bad, haughtily admitting no demonstration from it but its own. But from the west itself comes solid personality with blood and brawn and the deep quality of all-accepting fusion. Mm-hmm. That's something that we read today and we think, well, maybe that's a bit aggressive, that's a bit imperialistic.
What's like what I said before, where he has this vista, right? And
yes.
He has this. He thinks of the U.S. as a palimpsest, and
we
Americans, this new government can do what we want with it, and he's leaving the tribes, the Native American tribes that are already there.
I would have read this passage, when I was 12 years old in 1959, and I was, great. And now I read it and I say, well, let's get the brakes on. And also the idea of the Pacific Islands. It's interesting that I think it's 1959 in Hawaii voted overwhelmingly to become a state, part of the United States. And now, from a friend of mine who lives in Hawaii, that fact is sort of kept quiet. It's sort of like because of the sort of burgeoning of a notion of a repressed Hawaiian culture, that they're not so excited about celebrating statehood and part of the United States. And so they would read this much differently. They would say, we are not interested in that. And you can read this also in the context of the Pope's recent apology to the Indian tribes in Canada for the religious imperialism of the church in the Canadian situation. So that's just one example of Whitman. Part of him would have appealed to me in a different way when I was younger, and now I read that and I think, well, that kind of thinking has led to some grievous wrongs also.
When I read passages like that and think the thoughts that you just expressed very well, I often feel torn, because the question I ask myself is, okay, do you feel bad about that, or are you going to take it back and wipe out the United States?
Mm-hmm.
And my answer to that is something like, that's too hard a question. And I guess I'd say something like, if I went back in time machine, I would hope I would support it, but I wouldn't want to wish the United States out of existence. So I'm just admitting that this is one of those moments where you look at the hardness of history and you feel torn. And I don't feel, I guess I don't feel ashamed of feeling torn about it. And in fact, I suppose I might feel more ashamed if I didn't feel torn one way or the other.
And you look at what I sometimes in discussions of these issues, I say, well, look at other countries. You can't look at the United States in isolation compared to what country is it a failure or a success, and what country in the world are you pointing to? The left had great hopes for the Soviet Union. Those hopes really didn't come to fruition. The Chinese, in an attempt to remake, a feudal society under the communists, the Great Leap Forward killed something like 30 million people. The Cultural Revolution probably killed almost as many. Today, you have a country that itself has tensions, from what I can read. China, which seems to be a kind of monolith when you look at it from a certain standpoint. If you read other things, they say, no, there's tremendous internal tensions in China that threaten that system. That's one of the reasons that there's been crackdowns, is because the party feels these tensions from below, and feels threatened by them. So there's no country that gets all A's on their report card. And the United States still draws immigrants from. I've always been amazed by the contradiction in certain critics on the left of the United States as a racist, oppressive country to people of color, and yet, and having repressive, immigration policies, and yet, why are people coming to the United? Why are they desperate to get into a place where the dominant cultural forces don't look like them?
What you said about the United States and the way its critics treat it, they always compare it to some ideal that has never existed, and of course, we're found wanting in contrast to the ideal. If you compare it to other nations, then we're talking, and you find out that nations, it turns out almost all nations are full of human beings, and human beings do bad shit. And the United States has done a lot, so we need to do what, I've clumsily tried to do in this podcast, which is to acknowledge it, own up to it, and accept it, and not pretend it's not there. But I will say that I'm still a patriot, and it, perhaps as much as anything else that I see nowadays, make me deeply, deeply grateful and proud of the country when I see an immigrant who comes here and is astonished by the negativity about the country, and says, "Let me tell you something about where I came from."
Yeah, right.
And it's they're not saying that the United States is perfect.
No,
they're saying that it's a system of government that has the possibility to do what Fitzgerald said in Gatsby, pursuing its own platonic conception, and that's beautiful and that's hopeful.
I think it's ironic that in some ways the United States suffers from kind of optimism that Democratic Vistas expresses. She expresses such great hopes for this, Edenic society emerging, for these great personalities, for there to be a flourishing of culture in every realm, that for America to outtop all previous societies, and particularly in its pursuit of equality, that anything is going to fall short. If you have this incredibly, it's sort of like looking at parents, idolizing them as kids, and then later, seeing them as people who have their flaws. Of course, you're going to be, disappointed in that regard.
But it's a maturation, part of maturation.
Yeah, and women,
maturation of citizens too.
And women has been considered not immature exactly, but sort of maybe a little naive and childish in his optimism, and that optimism can breed extreme bitter disappointment.
Yes. Well, as I said before, if you're going to give me an excess of optimism or an excess of pessimism or cynicism, I'll take the optimism. And it's not naive, and he's not just naive, and he qualifies himself repeatedly, points out how far from this ideal we are, and I'm sure he'd say the same thing at least today. But if you just extinguish the hope, and then what are you left with? For God's sake, why would you want to do that?
Looking at the things like his ideas about manifest destiny that we would look at skeptically now, his ideas about women are really ahead of their time, and the portraits that he paints, just read one of them or maybe two of them, of women of his time are so far ahead, at least to me, strike me as so far ahead of their time. He discusses what an ideal American manhood would be. But then he goes on to say, let me tell you about women who are equally as important. And he stresses that throughout, that women are absolutely as equal in every possible way as men, in terms of the rights they deserve, in terms of voting, and in terms of strength of character and ability to bloom.
Well, in one way better.
And in one way better. He has 4 paragraphs, each one a different portrait of what he sees as a modern woman that's different from the feudal past. And he hates the word lady. He has some very funny, sarcastic things to say about the connotations of the word lady.
2 feet.
Yes.
Too genteel.
So I'll read 2 of these because these are good. He says, I have seen another woman who, from taste and necessity conjoined, has gone into practical affairs, carries on a mechanical business, partly works at it herself, dashes out more and more into real hardy life, is not abashed by the coarseness of the contact, knows how to be firm and silent at the same time, holds her own with unvarying coolness and decorum, and will compare any day with superior carpenters, farmers, and even boatmen and drivers. For all that, she has not lost the charm of her womanly nature, but preserves and bears it fully, though through such rugged presentation. Then there is the wife of a mechanic, mother of 2 children, a woman of merely passable English education, but of fine wit, with all her sex's grace and intuitions, who exhibits indeed such a noble female personality that I am fain to record it here. Never abdicating her own proper independence, but always genially preserving it and what belongs to it, cooking, washing, child nursing, house tending, she beams sunshine out of all these duties and makes them illustrious. Physiologically sweet and sound, loving work, practical, yet she knows there are intervals, however few, devoted to recreation, music, leisure, hospitality, and affords such intervals. Whatever she does and wherever she is, that charm, that indescribable perfume of genuine womanhood attends her, goes with her, exhales from her, which belongs of right to all the sex, and is or ought to be the invariable atmosphere and common aureola of old as well as young.
Yeah.
Really good. And one more, because they're just
Peacemaker.
they're really
Peacemaker.
Well, I'm going to read the first one, and then you can read the Peacemaker.
Okay.
They're both. I have seen a young American woman, one of a large family of daughters. Oh, and by the way, the language here, when he's describing specifics, he can be very precise and down to earth.
Yeah.
You have no problem following what he's saying at all.
I didn't notice that until just now.
Yeah.
When he's talking about something down to earth.
Yeah.
His prose goes down to earth. Yeah.
And so if he wanted to
That's
be,
great.
it's like his journalistic background comes
Yes,
in, and he's a
reporting.
reporter writing concise and
He's reporting.
like news flash it.
Yeah.
He says, I have seen a young American woman, one of a large family of daughters, who some years since migrated from her meager country home to one of the northern cities to gain her own support. She soon became an expert seamstress, but finding the employment too confining for health and comfort, she went boldly to work for others to housekeep, cook, clean, etc. After trying several places, she fell upon one where she was suited. She has told me that she finds nothing degrading in her position. It is not inconsistent with personal dignity, self-respect, and the respect of others. She confers benefits and receives them. She has good health. Her presence itself is healthy and bracing. Her character is unstained. She has made herself understood and preserves her independence and has been able to help her parents and educate and get places for her sisters. And her course of life is not without opportunities for mental improvement and of much quiet, uncosting happiness and love.
Yeah.
They're unlike, if he's describing the difference between the feudal conception of lady and the modern conception of woman, these are, I think, very powerful vignettes.
Yeah, and it's so perfect for Whitman because he follows his principles. He thinks, look, everyone, every human being, every rational animal, every creature with a soul is just as valuable as every other in the religious sense, but also in the political sense. And so he just envisions, this is kind of a vista for womanhood, you could say, of different possibilities. And these women choose different paths. And there's one that I'll just summarize real quickly, a woman that he calls a woman from Long Island who was 80 years old, and she was known by the name of the Peacemaker, capital P. She was well towards 80, happy and sunny temperament, had always lived on a farm, neighborly, sensible, discreet, and a favorite of everybody. But the fun thing was that she had come to be a tacitly agreed upon domestic regulator, judge, settler of difficulties, and reconciler in the land. So she's just, like that neighborhood, sage or kind of informal judge.
Yeah.
And these are all very different lives, from the businesswoman to the woman who goes domestic and is totally satisfied with it. This is Walt Whitman looking at what he sees now and projecting into the future. And of course, we all know that there are some feminists that would criticize this, and especially the woman who lives a domestic life and say, well, Walt thinks she's happy, but she's not happy. Right. Well, there are other feminists who would say, wait a minute, that's going too far. We should have a little Walt Whitman and recognize that each woman is an individual, single, solitary soul that should be absolutely free to do what she damn well wants, and become what she damn well wants. In other passages, the passage I have in mind is when Whitman says something about women being better, he's talking about motherhood. And if you go back to the passage, of course, it's a controversy today, but Whitman was an essentialist, right? He talks about the charm of womanly nature, a noble female personality. This will, I'm sure, make some people very unhappy. The indescribable perfume of genuine womanhood attends her, goes with her, exhales from her, which belongs of right to all the sex. Now, I'm sure there's some valid criticisms there, but as I said to David before the show, it seems to me that Walt was a proto-feminist, a suffragette before suffragette, and I can prove it. He says, the day is coming when the deep questions of woman's entrance amid the arenas of practical life, politics, the suffrage, and etc., will not only be argued all around us, but may be put to decision in real experiment. So he's writing this about a half century before it happened in the 19th century. Right, so if you kind of criticize Walt's way of looking at women, well, you got to give him a lot of credit, even if you don't think he's rung the bell for you. As I said to David, he was like a proto-feminist, and in his day, for a long time thereafter, after the the suffrage movement happened, he was, say, a mainstream feminist, and nowadays people might call him a turf.
Yeah. I would point out, though, that in the section where he describes the housewife, he says never abrogating her own proper independence, but always genially preserving it. That he thinks women have a proper independence, which at the time, many men would say women don't have a proper independence.
Absolutely.
They're properly dependent. There is no proper women, independence.
Yeah.
He stresses that, and at the end he sums these up. He says, the foregoing portraits, I admit, are frightfully out of line from these imported models of womanly personality, the stock feminine characters of the current novelists or of the foreign court poems. Ophelias, Enid's, princesses, ladies of one thing or another, which fill the envying dreams of so many poor girls and are accepted by our men too, as supreme ideas of feminine excellence to be sought after. But I present mine just for a change.
Yeah, he doesn't want any weak women. He doesn't want Ophelia be heartbroken and drowning. You should probably wind it up.
Okay.
But what I'm going to do now, and I'll just say it out loud in case I decide not to cut and paste, but it's possible that after I review the tape, I'll think, okay, what I'm going to do now might have been helpful early on. And if it is, I'll just splice it in there. But I'm going to try to give what I take to be the theses of Democratic Vistas, because it is big. It's this kind of gigantic offspring of Whitman's mind, to use his phrase. And it's hard to get hold of it. And I've tried now. It's certainly not an excellent job, but it's probably somewhat helpful. So these are the theses that seem to me to stand out, that he dives into deeply and in the rough order that they come. And we've touched on some of them, so I'll try not to read any passages because it's late. He begins by talking about the uniqueness of America and its awesome future possibility, right? It is nascent for him and it's not fulfilled, but he sees these vistas of the future, all these things undone, but possible. Democracy, with its universal suffrage, however, has its dangers. We talked about that. Things kind of hang in the balance. And why? Because he says the people, most of them, especially in the lump, are vulgar. And vulgar men, not educated, not fulfilled in the way that they can be. He talks about being cankered, crude, superstitious, and rotten. Nasty, as you said. And these are the very people that he turns around and champions over and over again and balances with the Pennsylvania soldier, for example. He's confident, has no doubt the youth will prosper economically, even democratically, and he's speaking of suffrage in particular, and educationally. But he has serious doubts about, in fact, he has no doubts about the conviction that that's not enough. So he has no doubts that we'll prosper in those ways, but he says they are not enough. It will not be enough spiritually unless one thing happens. We create our own art, a unique American literature, especially poetry. Walt happens to be a poet. So he says, this is 4A. I too hail those achievements with pride and enjoy he's talking about all the stunning material gains that we've made. He's writing this during the Gilded Age, and David could explain it at length, but I'll just point out that it's the age after the Civil War, and it was a time of great economic leaps and bounds ahead, at least for parts of the country, the victorious part. And he was worried that we were becoming too materialistic, and less spiritual. So he says, I hail those achievements with pride and joy, though he doesn't dismiss them. Always the balance, right? He always retains things. Then answer that the soul of man will not with such only, nay, not with such at all, be finally satisfied, but needs what? The soul needs what? Standing on these and on all things, as the feet stand on the ground, is addressed to the loftiest, to itself alone. So there's something about the inner self that connects with this literature he's calling for and will not be satisfied or fulfilled until it has it. The passage David read before, that this literature is perhaps the central point in any nation, especially a nation's archetypal poem. So maybe Song of Myself is one. And here's one I'll read just because it's such kind of highfalutin, ecstatic prose. Literature is more important than government. He says, should some 2 or 3 really original American poets rise, mounting the horizon like planets, stars of the first magnitude that from their eminence would give more compaction and more moral identity, quality today most needed to these states, than all its constitutions, legislative and judicial ties, and all its hitherto political, warlike, or materialistic experiences. I don't know if I read that well, but he's saying that all the literature is more important than all of it. He's constantly using words like only, alone, must, and utmost, always going to the extreme. He's using words like bold, build, achieve, create, and new. Yeah. He uses words like grand, archetypal, proclaim, and my favorite, promulge, which I've never read before. But it's like proclaim, right, or prophesy. We shall do a podcast later on Song of Myself. I promulge it. Also prophecy, future, real, and realize, make real. Emotion, mind, inspire, arouse, love, cosmic, soul, divine, incarnate, and perhaps above all, self. I talked about his ambition before and how he builds up the Greeks and the Hebrews and their literature and then trumps them, right? We're going to surmount them because we're Americans. We don't take second place to anybody. But we haven't done anything yet if we do things right. The current state of hypocrisy and distrust could give way to a utopian future state. Right now, the problem is we have too little soul, too much body. So how will we do it? Through the new literature? and the new literature has to recognize and celebrate the common man. I read that passage about the people, right? It has to be about the people because the individual solitary soul is just as important as any other and connects with the divine. That's, I think, what he has in mind when he talks about religion. He says the new literature has to be religious. And you think, well, you mean like organized religion? And he means, no, not that at all. Organized religion would stunt the individual, infinite soul. I'm at the last point here. He talks about how America not being aristocratic levels. It's this great leveling. Everybody is, at least ideally, should be the same. And I know, don't tell me that that's never been true. I know it's not true. Walt knew it wasn't true. He's calling for it, but we have the capacity to level in the sense of value politically. Each individual is just as values any other. But that leveling, and I guess a modest paradox, is what allows us all to be individuals, and to use the word David has used well before, the balloon, to be free, to choose what we want to be. And he could say, I suppose, sing songs of ourselves. He says, the very purpose of democracy is to illustrate at all hazards this doctrine or theory that man, properly trained in sanest, highest freedom, may and must become a law, a series of laws unto himself. That I think is beautiful, and I think that does summarize him in a nice way.
I would add one
absolutely.
thing. Well, he talks about contradictions. He says they're going to be contradictions. Yeah. So he's calling about, the great common people, and in some way, he's the very poet of inclusiveness.
Right.
But at the end, very near the end, he has this paragraph where he kind of falls back. He kind of recognizes that in the same way that, I think Lenin said, there needs to be a party to lead. They need to lead the people. Yeah. So near the end, like I think 3 paragraphs from the end, he says about the need for the enlightened, few. Okay. And he says, yet I have dreamed, merged in that hidden, tangled problem of our fate, whose long unraveling stretches mysteriously through time, dreamed out, portrayed, hinted already, a little or larger band, a band of brave and true, unprecedented yet, armed and equipped at every point, the members separated, it may be, by different dates and states, or south or north or east or west, Pacific, Atlantic, Southern, Canadian, a year, a century here, and other centuries there, but always one, compact in soul, conscience conserving, God inculcating, inspired achievers, not only in literature, the greatest art, but achievers in all art, a new undying order dynasty, which is an interesting word to use because dynasty would seem to be the least democratic term you could think of. Yeah. Dynasty from age to age transmitted, a band, a class.
Oh, wow.
At least as fit to cope with current years, our dangers, needs, as those who, for their times, so long, so well, in armor or in cowl, church or army, upheld and made illustrious that far back feudal priestly world. To offset chivalry, indeed, those vanished countless knights, old altars, abbeys, priests, ages and strings of ages, a knightlier and more sacred cause today demands and shall supply, in a new world, to larger, grander work, more than the counterpart and tally of them. So it's kind of saying there's this, after all this democratic talk, there's this sort of enlightened elite who need, and you can find them in different times and in different parts of the country, but they have to lead. And the stakes of this are, Joe and I discussed this earlier, but he comes to the final stakes. He says, we better achieve this, or else our modern civilization, with all its improvements, is in vain. And we are on the road to a destiny, a status equivalent in the real world to that of the fabled dam.
Yes, I remember we talked about that passage, and our soul hangs in the balance here. Right?
The stakes could not be higher.
David, I really, really appreciate you spending all this time and driving to visit me and doing such a wonderful podcast.
This was a lot of fun, and learned a lot about Democratic Vistas from your reading of it, which is
thank you.
Which is great, and I think it's the perfect thing for you because of your background in the classics and the great books that you have a context to put it in. That I don't have, so that's really educational.
Well, wonderful. You beat me to it. I was about to finish and say the thing I like most about it, aside from just seeing an old friend, was that I learned a ton. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, and thanks to Walt. He was a generous character. You can't help but kind of find him sort of lovable. I think he's one of the more lovable literary figures.
I'm smitten. I'm smitten.
Okay. All righty. Great.
All right. We'll see you next time. Whatever podcast that is.